Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the most mind-blowing rises to power in history. Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of a scandalous marriage, born into a fractured dynasty and forced to navigate the treacherous waters of the Tudor court. Her story is nothing short of incredible. You probably won't survive this one, considering the drama, the backstabbing, and the sheer intensity of it all. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you're tuning in, drop your city and the time it is where you are, just so I can imagine where in the world you're taking in this story. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's talk about Elizabeth's early years. As a child, her life was anything but normal. Born in 1533 to King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth came into the world at a time when her father's kingdom was a powder keg of religious, political, and personal conflicts. The Tudor dynasty was struggling, and it didn't take long for Elizabeth's life to be thrown into complete chaos. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed when Elizabeth was just 2.5 years old, and just like that, the world changed. A little girl who had once been the apple of her father's eye was now cast aside, a second-class royal at best, even though she was his legitimate daughter. The turmoil didn't end with Anne's death. Elizabeth was declared illegitimate after Anne's execution, and Henry VIII quickly remarried, trying to secure a male heir, failing miserably, which left Elizabeth in a constant state of political uncertainty. Her early years were marked by isolation, with no real place in the line of succession, and no guarantee that her future would be anything more than a pawn in a royal Game of Thrones. If you think about it, Elizabeth's childhood was anything but stable. She was orphaned by her mother, forced into a world of betrayal and constant shifting allegiances, and had to fend for herself in a world that didn't see her as worthy of power. But, strangely, this tumultuous beginning would be exactly what made Elizabeth who she was. After Anne's death, she lived a life of uncertainty, shuffled between different households, and often left to her own devices. Henry VIII was unpredictable and erratic in his affections, so even though Elizabeth was still a royal, she was often sidelined and left in the shadows. Her existence was uncomfortable, like a piece of furniture that's important enough to be in the room but not quite noticed. It was lonely, it was isolated, and it was often terrifying. There were whispers that she wasn't truly royal because her parents' marriage had been declared invalid. Still, Elizabeth had something that no one realised just yet: a remarkable resilience and the ability to survive under the most hostile of circumstances. But she wasn't the only child in the mix. Elizabeth had a half-sister, Mary Tudor, the daughter of Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Mary was born of a legitimate marriage, and for much of her early life she was the designated heir to the throne. But when Henry VIII decided to break from the Catholic Church to marry Anne, he effectively severed England from papal authority, setting off a religious war that would change the country forever. Mary was devoutly Catholic and was devastated by her father's decision, which made her position as heir increasingly precarious. She never forgave her father for what he did to her mother. When Mary took the throne after Henry's death in 1547, she tried to restore Catholicism in England by any means necessary, including persecuting Protestants, leading to her infamous nickname, Bloody Mary. But what did this all mean for Elizabeth? Well, it meant she was constantly living in a state of danger. With Mary on the throne, Elizabeth was seen as a potential rival, someone who could stake a claim to the throne herself. And while Elizabeth's legitimacy was often in question, the very fact that she had Tudor blood made her a constant political threat. As a young woman, Elizabeth wasn't in control of her life, her destiny, or her safety. She was merely a chess piece in a deadly game of royal politics. For much of Mary's reign, Elizabeth was under house arrest, surrounded by spies and with no clear future in sight. To make matters worse, there were numerous plots to dethrone Mary and place Elizabeth on the throne, forcing Elizabeth to live a life on the run, hiding from political enemies and potential execution. You could almost say that Elizabeth's life was like being stuck in a pressure cooker for years. The constant threat of betrayal, the endless political games, and the deep sense of isolation. All of these experiences shaped her into something no one expected. In the Tudor court, survival wasn't just about outliving your enemies, it was about outsmarting them, and Elizabeth was learning every trick in the book, whether she realised it or not. It would be years before she got her moment to rise, but all of this hardship laid the foundation for what would come. In the next chapters, we'll see how her sharp intellect and steady resolve would eventually pull her from the ashes of a broken childhood into the halls of power. The Tudor dynasty wasn't just in turmoil, it was barely holding itself together. From the moment Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII, split from the Catholic Church, England became a kingdom marked by a religious and political chaos. Each of Henry's marriages had left the kingdom more fractured than the last. Elizabeth's half-brother, Edward VI, who would eventually inherit the throne after Henry's death, was a sickly child, and his reign would be short and uneventful. After his death, England was still grappling with the question of who would inherit the crown. Mary Tudor, Elizabeth's half-sister, eventually ascended to the throne, but her reign was far from stable. When Mary took the throne in 1553, she immediately set about restoring Catholicism and undoing her father's Protestant reforms. In her mind, the legitimacy of the Catholic faith, and therefore her rule, was bound to her ability to suppress Protestantism. She had the support of the Catholic factions, but that didn't mean her reign would be smooth. Religious tensions boiled over, and Mary's attempts to rid England of heresy, mostly through burning Protestants at the stake, earned her the nickname Bloody Mary. Her determination to undo the Protestant legacy left by her father and brother turned her reign into a bloody and divisive one. Meanwhile, Elizabeth stood quietly in the background, watching the political currents that surrounded her. For a long time, she had no idea if she would ever wear the crown. Her position was precarious at best, as she was constantly caught between two warring factions, the Catholics who saw her as an illegitimate pretender to the throne, and the Protestants who considered her the rightful heir. Elizabeth was not yet queen, but she had the bloodline, and that made her a constant symbol of hope or fear, depending on who was watching. Still, Elizabeth had no desire to engage in this battle. She was determined to outlive the turmoil, to let her siblings fight it out for as long as they could. But as Mary's reign continued, Elizabeth began to realise something that would shape her entire political strategy. It wasn't enough to survive. She needed to be strategic. Elizabeth understood the fragile nature of the throne and how quickly a monarch could fall from grace. Unlike Mary, who had no real interest in diplomacy, Elizabeth would play the long game, carefully watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Her quiet and measured approach was beginning to form, and those who underestimated her saw only a pale, quiet figure, while Elizabeth carefully observed how the power dynamics shifted around her. It was like she had a sixth sense for when to remain silent and when to speak, an essential trait in a world that was constantly on the brink of chaos. Mary's reign was growing increasingly unpopular, and in 1558, the long-awaited turning point finally arrived. Mary died, and Elizabeth became Queen of England. But it wasn't as simple as just stepping into a crown. Elizabeth had inherited a fractured kingdom. The English people had no real reason to trust her. After all, she was the daughter of the woman they had executed. She was also a Protestant in a country that had, only recently, been forced to reconcile its Catholic roots. Elizabeth faced one of the most difficult challenges any monarch could: how to unite a divided kingdom. It's worth noting that the English throne was under constant threat from foreign powers, and Elizabeth had not just domestic challenges to deal with. Spain was one of the strongest Catholic powers at the time, and it loomed large in the background of every decision Elizabeth made. Spain's King Philip II had been married to Elizabeth's sister Mary, and he had designs on controlling the English throne through marriage, or force. But Elizabeth wasn't one to be easily intimidated. From the moment she became queen, she understood that her survival, and the survival of her nation, depended on a combination of careful political manoeuvring, unyielding diplomacy, and a steady hand. It was in these early days of her reign that Elizabeth's genius as a politician began to shine. The English court had always been a place of constant intrigue, filled with ambitious men and women who sought power for themselves. Elizabeth, however, played her cards very carefully, knowing full well that her best move was often to do nothing. As soon as she became queen, Elizabeth sought to calm the religious divisions that had torn England apart for decades. While she was Protestant, she was careful not to alienate Catholics outright. Instead, she adopted a policy of religious tolerance that allowed both sides to coexist, though she leaned more toward Protestantism in public life. She wasn't just trying to keep the peace. She was setting the stage for a dynasty that could survive all the forces conspiring against it. It's interesting to note that while Elizabeth had the wisdom to avoid religious extremism, She was not averse to using religion as a political tool when necessary. She understood the power of symbolism, and she understood that religion could both unite and divide. Elizabeth would never fully align herself with one side or the other, but instead she would find ways to use the growing tensions between Catholicism and Protestantism to her advantage. She knew that if she could keep the factions divided, they would be less likely to unite against her. The early part of her reign was marked by political caution and wisdom, but Elizabeth wasn't simply biding her time. Her skill in diplomacy and court politics allowed her to take control of the kingdom in a way that few had expected. By playing both sides, maintaining her Protestant identity while cautiously embracing Catholic elements, she positioned herself as a unifying force. But more than that, Elizabeth began to gather loyal followers, advisors who saw in her not just a queen, but a shrewd and capable leader. This balance of caution and intelligence would become her hallmark, and her reign would eventually come to define an era, the Elizabethan Age. In the early years of Elizabeth's reign, her very survival was a delicate game of balancing religious factions, foreign powers, and the ambitions of the English court. She understood that a monarch's reign could be precarious, and the last thing she wanted was for the same fate to befall her that had taken her mother, Anne Boleyn, and sister Mary Tudor. Elizabeth wasn't just a figurehead. She had to play an active role in maintaining her rule, especially as she had inherited a deeply divided kingdom. Her Protestant leanings were clear, but how far she could push those beliefs without enraging the Catholic majority was a question that required careful navigation. But it wasn't just religious divisions that threatened her reign. Elizabeth's claim to the throne was also a target. Being the daughter of Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, made her position as legitimate monarch debatable in the eyes of many. Even though her mother had been executed for treason, leaving Elizabeth with a precarious status, Elizabeth had never stopped claiming her birthright. It was this deep-rooted belief in her right to rule that would fuel her decisions throughout her reign. Though there were constant whispers about her legitimacy, especially from her Catholic enemies, Elizabeth's quiet confidence in her heritage gave her the strength to persevere. But legitimacy wasn't the only threat she faced. The English court was also filled with rival factions and ambitious men who had their eyes on the throne. It was said that Elizabeth's court was like a living chessboard, with advisors, courtiers, and foreign diplomats constantly manoeuvring for influence. As a woman, Elizabeth was doubly scrutinised. A queen could be a dangerous proposition in a world dominated by men, especially in a court where the idea of a woman ruling was still a source of gossip and doubt. Many believed that Elizabeth, no matter her bloodline, could never truly command the authority of a male monarch. But Elizabeth's skill at playing the game of court politics soon proved them wrong. One of the most pressing challenges she faced early on was the question of marriage. As queen, Elizabeth was constantly bombarded with suggestions from suitors, foreign diplomats, and advisors, all of whom wanted her to marry, preferably to someone who could solidify her power and alliances. But Elizabeth, who had witnessed firsthand the disastrous consequences of marriage for her mother and sister, was resolute in her refusal to marry. She knew that marrying would tie her to one man, and with it, potentially diminish her own power. As a ruler, her independence was non-negotiable, and she could not allow any one man or foreign power to dictate her choices. This, of course, left her open to constant rumours about her sexuality, her relationships, and her Virgin Queen persona. However, marriage was not just a personal choice, it was also a matter of national security. Foreign powers, particularly Spain, were deeply concerned about Elizabeth's refusal to marry. King Philip II of Spain, still smutting from his failed marriage to her sister Mary, desperately wanted Elizabeth to marry him. The idea of a Spanish alliance through marriage was appealing to him, but Elizabeth saw through the ruse. Marrying Philip would be a political and personal disaster. Instead, Elizabeth used the idea of marriage as a diplomatic tool, flirting with suitors, manipulating foreign alliances, and creating a sense of intrigue that kept potential enemies off balance. One of the most famous of these suitors was Robert Dudley, a childhood friend of Elizabeth's and someone with whom she had a complex relationship. Dudley was a handsome, charismatic nobleman, and for a time it was rumoured that Elizabeth was deeply in love with him. But Elizabeth's refusal to marry him, despite their obvious affection for one another, was another calculated decision. Dudley had been involved in the suspicious death of his wife, which made him politically dangerous as a potential husband. More importantly, Elizabeth's refusal to marry him solidified her position as the single, independent monarch who was beholden to no one. The relationship with Dudley, while full of personal affection, was always kept at arm's length, reinforcing Elizabeth's political independence. While marriage remained a source of tension, Elizabeth found ways to turn her virginity into a symbol of power. Her virgin queen image became central to her identity, a carefully cultivated persona that allowed her to maintain control over her throne and her country. It was a tool for foreign diplomacy, a statement of independence, and paradoxically a source of national pride. Elizabeth's image as the unmarried queen was a brilliant piece of propaganda. She was not bound to any man, and by remaining unattached, she became the embodiment of England itself. In the minds of her people, Elizabeth was not just their ruler. She was the eternal queen, the symbol of England's unity and power. But of course, this image of the Virgin Queen wasn't just about avoiding marriage, it was also about avoiding the fate that had befallen her mother and sister. Anne Boleyn's execution had been a bloody end to a marriage that had promised so much. Mary Tudor, despite her claims to the throne, had lived through an equally tumultuous reign. Both of these women had been used as pawns in their marriages, and Elizabeth would not repeat their mistakes. Instead, she chose a different kind of marriage, a marriage to her people, to her country, and to her power. In many ways, Elizabeth's rejection of marriage was part of her broader strategy to remain untouchable, both physically and politically. It allowed her to wield power without being subject to anyone else's will, but it also gave her the freedom to become a monarch who was not just a figurehead, but a force in her own right. This was a woman who ruled with a calculated calm, one who used every advantage, whether it was her virginity, her intelligence, or her personal charm, to ensure that no one would ever challenge her rule without first realising the danger of doing so. And then came the Spanish Armada. In 1588, Elizabeth's leadership was put to the ultimate test when the Spanish Armada, a fleet of more than 130 ships, set sail from Spain with the intention of invading England and dethroning the Queen. It wasn't just a military threat, it was a direct challenge to her reign, and the fate of her country hung in the balance. For Elizabeth, this was the moment her entire life had been preparing for. All the diplomacy, all the careful political manoeuvring, and all the years of building up England's navy and defences came down to this one confrontation. The Spanish Armada wasn't just a foreign invasion, it was a contest for England's survival, a fight for the very soul of the nation. The Spanish had long been angry over England's Protestantism, and the rise of England as a naval power had only deepened their resentment. Elizabeth's support of the Protestant Dutch rebels and her pirate-like actions against the Spanish treasure ships had soured relations for years. For Philip II of Spain, the situation was simple. Elizabeth was a heretic queen who needed to be removed from the throne to restore Catholicism in England. If England fell to Spain, the balance of power in Europe would shift dramatically, and Catholicism would reign once more. It was a religious and political struggle of monumental proportions, and Philip was determined to see it through. Elizabeth, however, was not one to be easily intimidated. While Spain's fleet was enormous and far more powerful on paper, Elizabeth's navy, although smaller, was fast and nimble. Her sailors, many of whom had gained experience through years of raiding Spanish ships, were seasoned and ruthless. But it wasn't just military strategy that would determine the outcome. Elizabeth had one key advantage: her leadership. In the face of Spain's overwhelming power, she remained unshaken. Her resolve became clear when, on the eve of battle, she addressed her troops at Tilbury. Standing in front of her soldiers, dressed in armour, she delivered a speech that would echo through history. "I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too," she proclaimed, instilling her troops with a sense of unity and purpose that was palpable. The battle itself was a high-stakes game of strategy. The Spanish Armada, initially confident of its victory, found itself at a disadvantage when confronted by the more agile English ships. The English navy used fire ships, vessels set ablaze and sent into the Spanish fleet to scatter the enemy. The Spanish, unable to regroup, were forced into a retreat, and what followed was a brutal series of skirmishes along the English coast. Though the Armada was not entirely destroyed, its strength was severely diminished, and its ability to mount an effective invasion of England was broken. The victory was not just a military triumph, it was a testament to Elizabeth's leadership and her ability to unite her people in the face of impossible odds. The Spanish defeat marked a turning point in Elizabeth's reign, cementing her legacy as a monarch who could not only survive the threats against her, but also emerge victorious. It was a defining moment for England as a nation, and for Elizabeth as a ruler. The defeat of the Armada was celebrated as a divine triumph, a victory that proved the righteousness of Elizabeth's Protestant cause and the strength of the English monarchy. Elizabeth, ever the tactician, made sure to frame the victory as one for God and for England. The Spanish, she declared, had been humbled by God's intervention. It was an image of divine favour that worked wonders for her popularity and for the cohesion of the country. But as with all great victories, there was a cost. While the Armada had been defeated, it had taken a heavy toll on England. The aftermath of the battle saw England's treasury drained, and the country was left to deal with the scars of war. Yet Elizabeth's popularity soared, and she was able to use this victory to strengthen her position both at home and abroad. She had earned the respect of Europe's other monarchs, particularly those who had been sceptical of her rule as a woman. The defeat of Spain demonstrated to the world that Elizabeth was a ruler of formidable strength and intellect. On a more personal level, Elizabeth's victory over the Spanish Armada solidified her as the true monarch of England. Her reign, which had always been a struggle to prove her legitimacy and power, had now been validated on the world stage. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. Elizabeth was now seen as the sovereign who had successfully defended her kingdom against the might of one of the most powerful nations in the world. Her leadership during the crisis had demonstrated that she was more than capable of ruling and protecting her people. But even as she basked in the glory of her triumph, Elizabeth remained keenly aware that her position could be undermined at any moment. The threat of foreign invasion, particularly from Catholic powers like Spain, was never far from her thoughts. Elizabeth understood that the survival of her reign would depend not only on her ability to win wars, but also on her ability to manage the shifting alliances and rivalries that defined European politics. And so she continued to use diplomacy, patronage, and even espionage to secure England's place in the world. She wasn't just a queen, she was a master of statecraft, a ruler who understood the precarious nature of power and the necessity of constant vigilance. In the years following the defeat of the Armada, Elizabeth's reign entered its golden age. She presided over a flourishing of English culture, with the works of Shakespeare, Marlowe, and other playwrights defining an era. Explorers like Sir Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh set sail to distant lands, bringing back wealth and prestige to England. The country began to rise as a global power, and Elizabeth's leadership was at the heart of it all. But her rise to power, her struggle for legitimacy, and her defence of her kingdom against overwhelming odds had prepared her for this moment. She was not just a survivor, she was a queen who had proven herself both to her people and to the world. With the victory over the Spanish Armada, Elizabeth's stature as one of the most capable rulers of her time was solidified. Yet even as England basked in the afterglow of triumph, Elizabeth's reign remained fraught with challenges. Her leadership had earned her the respect of many, but it also made her enemies, both within her kingdom and abroad. The very strength that allowed Elizabeth to overcome the Spanish threat was the same one that made her such a compelling target for those who opposed her. As one of the longest reigning monarchs in England's history, Elizabeth's ability to stay in power for over 4 decades was, in itself, a remarkable feat. But while she had triumphed over foreign invasions, Elizabeth's greatest struggle was the constant battle for control at home. The issue of succession loomed over her entire reign. Elizabeth's decision not to marry and her inability to produce an heir became a matter of great political concern. As the years wore on, Elizabeth remained the virgin queen, yet the question of who would inherit her throne became more pressing. While she had many suitors throughout her life, she never chose one, and the refusal to marry had begun to frustrate some of her advisors. Despite the countless proposals from foreign rulers and noblemen, Elizabeth held firm to her independence. By the time the 1590s rolled around, Elizabeth was no longer the young, vibrant monarch who had ascended to the throne in 1558. The physical toll of ruling, the personal sacrifices she had made, and the emotional weight of an aging reign began to show. But what she lacked in youth, Elizabeth more than made up for in political savvy. She may have been unmarried and childless, but her ability to manage power, her understanding of diplomacy, and her sheer will to maintain control of the throne made her an indomitable figure. The uncertainty of the succession, however, was a growing problem. Elizabeth's closest relatives, including her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, posed a threat to her rule. Mary, a Catholic queen with a legitimate claim to the English throne, had been imprisoned for years by Elizabeth. The English Queen saw Mary as a serious rival, and Mary's supporters in England were constantly conspiring to see her placed on the throne. Despite Elizabeth's cautious approach to dealing with Mary, the Catholic threat was always present. As a result, the execution of Mary in 1587 was a decision that Elizabeth agonised over. She had kept Mary alive for years, hoping to avoid any conflict. But when it became clear that Mary was part of a Catholic conspiracy to overthrow her, Elizabeth had no choice but to sign the death warrant. The execution was a pivotal moment in Elizabeth's reign, and while it eliminated a serious threat to her throne, it also sealed her fate. Catholic countries, most notably Spain, were enraged, and Elizabeth's political position became even more precarious. Despite the turmoil, Elizabeth's reign was not only defined by wars and plots, but also by cultural achievements that would shape the course of English history. The Elizabethan age saw an explosion of artistic and literary brilliance. The work of playwrights like William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and Ben Jonson would go on to influence English literature for centuries to come. The theatre became a central part of Elizabethan life, with audiences flocking to see performances in the newly built theatres. Shakespeare's plays, full of political intrigue, romance, and historical drama, reflected the turbulent times in which they were written. Yet beneath the surface they also celebrated the power of England, and by extension the monarchy that was keeping the country united in a time of constant uncertainty. The cultural renaissance that flourished during Elizabeth's reign was an essential part of the legacy she left behind, turning England into a cultural powerhouse. However, Elizabeth's achievements in the arts and the cultural flourishing she oversaw were matched by the difficulties of a failing economy in her later years. Despite her earlier successes, the latter part of her reign was marked by increasing financial strain. The military expeditions against Spain and the costs of maintaining a large, expensive navy had drained the royal treasury. The English economy was struggling, and as the Queen grew older, it became more difficult to maintain the same level of authority over her court and kingdom. Elizabeth's health began to decline, and with it her ability to manage the mounting challenges facing the realm. As Elizabeth aged, her decisions became more cautious, and some of her advisors began to question whether her reign had run its course. The Elizabethan age, which had once been marked by expansion and bold moves, was now facing the reality of an uncertain future. Her court, which had once been a lively centre of culture, began to fracture under the weight of internal tensions. Elizabeth's refusal to marry or name a successor left the kingdom in a precarious position. The longer she delayed securing the line of succession, the greater the uncertainty over who would follow her. This power vacuum would eventually contribute to England's transition from the Tudor to the Stuart dynasty after Elizabeth's death. Yet despite these challenges, Elizabeth remained the queen of her people until the very end. Her reign had been a mixture of bold military decisions, strategic diplomacy, and careful navigation of domestic politics. Elizabeth had faced down foreign threats, survived plots against her life, and ruled over a kingdom that became one of the most powerful nations in the world. Her ability to adapt, her intelligence, and her command over both her advisors and her people had earned her the respect of those around her. She was a monarch who had successfully managed to maintain her sovereignty in the face of constant challenges, and when she died in 1603 at the age of 69, Elizabeth I passed into history as one of the most remarkable rulers England had ever known. Her death marked the end of the Tudor dynasty, but it also brought about the rise of a new era, the reign of the Stuarts under her cousin, James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. Elizabeth's legacy, however, would endure for centuries. She had not only united her kingdom through political and religious turmoil, but she had also built an empire that would expand across the world in the centuries that followed. The Elizabethan age, while it ended with her passing, laid the foundations for the British Empire, and her image as the Virgin Queen would be immortalised in art, literature, and legend. Elizabeth's rise from a broken child to one of the most powerful monarchs in history was an unbelievable journey, one that defied all expectations. From a life of uncertainty and political instability, she had become the Queen of England, the ruler of an empire, and an enduring symbol of strength and leadership. And in the hearts and minds of the English people, she remains one of the greatest monarchs to have ever lived. As Elizabeth's reign reached its final years, her monarchy began to feel the weight of time. The robust, energetic queen who had once dominated the Tudor court now faced the inevitable decline that comes with age. Yet even in the twilight of her life, Elizabeth retained an astonishing grip on power, her presence still commanding respect. and her leadership remaining pivotal in the shaping of England's future. The physical toll of her lengthy reign, compounded by the relentless pressures of governing, had begun to wear on her. She had ruled through wars, political intrigue, betrayals, and countless crises, and although her mind remained sharp, the toll of her crown was undeniable. The question of succession loomed larger with each passing day. Elizabeth's refusal to marry, once a conscious choice rooted in her desire to preserve her independence, became a source of intense anxiety in her later years. Without a clear heir, the English throne stood in precarious limbo. Elizabeth's advisors, concerned about the stability of the kingdom, continued to urge her to name a successor, but the Queen remained firm in her refusal. She had witnessed the chaos that surrounded her father's marriages, her sister Mary's tumultuous reign, and the divisiveness of her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots. Her decision to remain childless and unmarried had prevented England from being plunged into the kind of succession crisis that had plagued her own childhood, but it also created a deeply uncertain future for her nation. With no direct heirs of her own, Elizabeth's death threatened to plunge England into an unknown future. Her most likely successor was James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. His claim to the English throne was grounded in his descent from Henry VII, Elizabeth's grandfather. While Elizabeth had long refused to name James as her successor, there were growing indications that she recognised the necessity of a peaceful transfer of power. Even so, her death meant the end of an era, the end of the Tudor dynasty, and the beginning of the Stuart dynasty, which would have its own set of challenges. But Elizabeth's influence on her kingdom was undeniable. She had turned a fractured and war-torn country into one of the most powerful nations in the world, and though the throne would pass to the Stuarts, the legacy of the Tudor monarchs would remain. While Elizabeth's death brought the end of the Tudor line, it also marked a moment in which the English monarchy itself had been irrevocably altered. Elizabeth had shaped the role of the monarch for centuries to come, and her leadership style became a template for later rulers. Her ability to maintain power through diplomacy and subtlety, her careful balancing of domestic politics and foreign relations, and her unparalleled resilience became a model for subsequent English monarchs. She wasn't simply a queen. Elizabeth was a symbol of England's strength, a monarch whose resilience had kept her kingdom intact during some of the most tumultuous times in its history. Her image, forever tied to the golden age of England, would be immortalised in portraits, in history books, and in the stories that future generations would tell. As her health began to deteriorate, Elizabeth's mind remained clear. In her final years, there was no sign of the retreating, weakened queen that one might expect. She continued to reign with the same decisiveness, though her body was increasingly frail. The queen who had once led her nation in youthful vigour now faced the inevitable passage of time. Still, her reign had created a legacy that no one could dispute. As she grew older, Elizabeth increasingly withdrew from public life, leaving much of the day-to-day governance in the hands of her trusted advisors, like Robert Cecil. Yet she still maintained ultimate authority, rarely signing anything without careful consideration. When Elizabeth passed away on March 24, 1603, the news reverberated across England and the world. Her death marked the end of the Tudor dynasty, but it also marked the beginning of a new era. James VI of Scotland ascended to the English throne as James I, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland for the first time. This shift in power was significant, not just because of the political ramifications, but because it marked the dawn of a new chapter in the history of the British Isles. Though the monarchy changed, the effects of Elizabeth's reign would continue to be felt for generations to come. Her funeral was a grand affair, befitting the Queen who had reigned for over 4 decades. Elizabeth was buried in Westminster Abbey beside her half-sister Mary. The fact that both queens, who had once been bitter rivals, were laid to rest side by side symbolised the resolution of the turbulence that had defined the Tudor years. The intertwining of their fates represented the tumultuous but ultimately successful legacy of the Tudor dynasty, a dynasty that had transformed England into a powerful, unified kingdom. The passing of Elizabeth I left a void that would be difficult to fill. Her successor, James I, faced the daunting task of living up to the legacy she had built. While James was an able ruler, his reign would be marked by struggles of his own, as he navigated the political, religious, and cultural challenges that Elizabeth had so expertly managed. Yet James's rule could never replicate the magic of the Elizabethan age. The Queen's ability to maintain unity within a kingdom constantly at war, her diplomatic genius, and her personal strength created an era that seemed to defy the norms of history. Elizabeth's legacy endured long after her death. The Elizabethan age would go down in history as a time of artistic brilliance, exploration, and the birth of modern England. Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Raleigh had created works and voyages that would continue to influence the world for centuries. England's global influence would continue to expand, culminating in the British Empire, whose reach would span the globe. The foundations for England's imperial power were laid during Elizabeth's reign, and the stories of her leadership, triumphs, and personal sacrifices continue to inspire future generations. In the end, Elizabeth's rise from a forgotten, illegitimate child to the mighty queen who ruled England for over 40 years remains one of the most remarkable tales in history. Her ability to overcome the obstacles of her birth, the betrayal of her family, and the numerous threats to her reign speaks to her intelligence, resilience, and unmatched political acumen. She wasn't just a queen, she was a symbol of the indomitable spirit of England itself, a queen who, against all odds, became one of the most powerful and revered monarchs in history. As Elizabeth I's reign passed into history, the impact of her rule began to crystallise, not just in the annals of England's political evolution, but in the very cultural fabric of the nation. The Elizabethan age, though defined by her leadership, was not merely a period of military and political achievements. It was also a time of flourishing arts, exploration, and intellectual growth that would shape England's future for centuries. The Queen's refusal to marry, her pursuit of religious tolerance, and her pragmatic approach to governance weren't just strokes of political genius. They were, in many ways, the very foundations of the modern English state. The arts, in particular, saw an unprecedented boom during Elizabeth's reign. This period is often considered the golden age of English literature and drama, and at the heart of it stood one of the greatest playwrights in history, William Shakespeare. Though Shakespeare's works would become renowned around the world during Elizabeth's time, his plays served as both entertainment and subtle commentary on the political landscape. His tragedies, comedies, and histories touched upon themes of power, succession, betrayal, and the nature of kingship, all concepts that resonated deeply in the context of Elizabeth's reign. His works, produced in the vibrant public theatres of London, celebrated the power of the monarchy and the human capacity for both greatness and folly, mirroring the tensions and triumphs of the time. At the same time, other cultural developments were taking place that would forever change the way the world saw England. The Elizabethan theatre, with its elaborate plays and performances, was a radical departure from the rigid and often church-dominated artistic traditions of previous centuries. Writers, poets, and thinkers were free to explore a broader range of subjects, and with that, English culture began to blossom in new and exciting ways. The works of poets like Edmund Spenser and Christopher Marlowe expanded the reach of English literature, elevating it to an international level and ensuring that the arts would remain central to England's identity long after Elizabeth's death. But Elizabeth's reign was not only about cultural achievements, it was also a time of significant global expansion. Exploration during her reign helped to lay the groundwork for what would eventually become the British Empire. Pioneers like Sir Francis Drake, Sir Walter Raleigh, and Martin Wolsey Miller expanded the horizons of the known world, charting new territories, establishing colonies, and bringing wealth back to England from the far reaches of the globe. Elizabeth's encouragement of these explorations, despite the risks, was not just an expression of imperial ambition. It was also a manifestation of her desire to place England at the forefront of the world stage. The sea voyages undertaken under her reign would result in the English establishing trade routes that stretched across the Atlantic and beyond, leading to the establishment of colonial power that would last for centuries. One of Elizabeth's most significant contributions, however, was her handling of religious conflict. As a Protestant queen in a Catholic world, her reign was marked by both subtle diplomacy and resolute action against those who sought to undermine her authority. The religious divide in England, which had begun with the actions of her father Henry VIII, reached a precarious peak under Elizabeth. While the Queen herself was Protestant, she understood that forcing the majority of the population into strict adherence to one faith would not only alienate her subjects, but could also risk political instability. Her settlement, the Elizabethan religious settlement, was a carefully crafted compromise that allowed for Protestantism to be the official faith while maintaining a certain level of tolerance for Catholic practices, ensuring that England would remain united in a way that had not been possible under the reign of her sister Mary Tudor. This approach, balancing diplomacy and firmness, allowed her to maintain a delicate peace while reinforcing her own authority. Elizabeth's pragmatic approach to religious and political tensions extended beyond England's borders. Her involvement in the 30 Years' War, her support of the Protestant cause in Europe, and her defence of her kingdom from Catholic powers like Spain and France reflected her complex understanding of international diplomacy. Despite the odds stacked against her, surrounded by powerful Catholic nations, Elizabeth deftly navigated these turbulent waters, using her intelligence and political acumen to steer her kingdom through some of the most dangerous and volatile periods of European history. At the same time, Elizabeth's personal relationships with her court were intricate, often fraught with political calculation. Her closest advisors, men like Sir William Cecil, Lord Burghley, and the fiery, sometimes reckless Robert Dudley, were more than just counsellors. They were key to her ability to maintain control of her realm. But her relationships with these men were always held at arm's length, as Elizabeth made it clearer that she ruled alone. She was known for her careful management of her courtiers and for her ability to pit one faction against another, keeping them vying for favour while never fully trusting any one individual. This cultivated an environment where loyalty to the Queen was paramount, and any hint of disloyalty could be met with swift retribution. The Queen's relationship with her people was also crucial to her success. Elizabeth was not just a distant figurehead, she understood the pulse of her nation and used her public appearances and speeches to reinforce the image of a monarch deeply connected with her people. Her famous speech at Tilbury in 1588, during the Spanish Armada crisis, is often cited as a perfect example of this. Dressed in armour, she stood before her troops and proclaimed, "I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." This speech, embodying both strength and authority, became a defining moment in her reign, reinforcing her image as a queen of remarkable fortitude. She was not simply a ruler. She was a symbol of national pride, and this connection to her people helped her navigate the roughest waters. However, this connection did not mean that Elizabeth was without enemies or dissenters. Throughout her reign, she had to contend with numerous plots against her life. Catholic conspirators, upset with her Protestant rule, regularly sought to overthrow her. One of the most dangerous was the Babington Plot of 1586, which aimed to assassinate the Queen and place her Catholic cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne. Elizabeth's ability to thwart these plots was not only a testament to her political skill, but also a reminder of how deeply her rule was resented by some segments of society. It was a constant reminder that, for all her accomplishments, her reign had never been truly safe or secure. In the final years of her reign, the weight of these tensions, combined with the challenges of an aging monarch, led to a sense of uncertainty about the future. But despite these challenges, Elizabeth remained a monarch who had firmly established her place in history. As the years passed, England's place in the world had been irrevocably shaped by her decisions. The arts, the military, and the foundations of the British Empire had all been laid down during her reign. Elizabeth I's legacy was not just in what she accomplished during her lifetime, but in the enduring image she left behind. A monarch who defied the odds, outlived rivals, and carved her name into history as one of the greatest rulers of her time. As Elizabeth IV's reign continued to unfold, the ripples of her leadership reached far beyond England's borders. Her careful handling of domestic issues, religious strife, and international relations had not only stabilised England, but had also given the country a distinct place in the wider European power struggle. Though Elizabeth's name would forever be associated with the Elizabethan Golden Age, her influence on European politics was just as profound as her cultural impact. Her reign marked the end of England's relative isolation from the European continent, and under her leadership, the nation began to assert itself in ways it never had before. The tension between Catholic and Protestant powers was a defining feature of Elizabeth's reign. The Protestant Reformation, which had swept across Europe, had led to bloody conflicts across the continent. Elizabeth, who had experienced the fall of her mother Anne Boleyn and her sister Mary Tudor due to religious conflicts, understood the importance of maintaining a balance at home. But she also knew that international politics required more than just maintaining peace within her borders. Her support of Protestant causes in Europe, particularly in the Netherlands, where Protestant rebels were fighting Spanish Catholic forces, marked a significant shift in England's foreign policy. Elizabeth's intervention in the conflict between Catholic Spain and Protestant Holland was a risk, as it angered Philip II of Spain, who was already planning his invasion of England. But Elizabeth knew that to preserve her throne and England's sovereignty, she could not remain neutral in the battle between Catholicism and Protestantism. By aligning with Protestant powers in Europe, she solidified England's role as a defender of Protestantism on the continent. This decision, however, was not without consequences. Philip II's resentment toward Elizabeth grew, and he began to take more aggressive action. The Spanish Armada, one of the most famous episodes of Elizabeth's reign, was the direct result of this ongoing religious and political rivalry. Spain, the most powerful Catholic nation at the time, could not allow a Protestant England to thrive so close to its own shores. Yet despite the odds, Elizabeth's forces prevailed. The defeat of the Armada was a turning point not only for Elizabeth's reign, but also for the power dynamics in Europe. It sent a clear message to Catholic Europe that England, under Elizabeth's leadership, would not be easily defeated or intimidated. In the wake of the Armada's defeat, Elizabeth's position as one of Europe's foremost monarchs was solidified. The victory gave England a sense of unity and national pride that had been previously absent. Elizabeth, for the first time in her reign, had become a symbol of divine providence and England's exceptionalism. The English people, who had long lived in the shadow of foreign threats and internal divisions, now saw their queen as a figure of both strength and grace, a monarch who had led them through their greatest crisis. This newfound sense of unity was critical, as Elizabeth would face new challenges in the years to come, particularly in her later years, when the question of succession became even more pressing. The problem of succession, however, continued to hang over Elizabeth's head. Though she had steadfastly refused to marry, preferring to remain an independent monarch, the issue of her heir became a looming concern. Elizabeth's advanced age made it increasingly likely that she would not live forever, and the absence of a direct heir left England vulnerable to potential instability. The longer Elizabeth remained unmarried and childless, the greater the pressure on her to choose a successor. Her advisers, who had long pushed her to name an heir, began to grow more vocal in their concerns, but Elizabeth, true to her nature, resisted all attempts to force her hand. She had seen the havoc wrought by her father's marriages and by her sister Mary's reign, and she was determined not to make the same mistake. The looming question of succession was complicated by the presence of Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, a Catholic queen, was a direct threat to Elizabeth's throne, especially given her legitimate claim to the English crown as a descendant of Henry VII. For many Catholics, Mary was the rightful Queen of England, and Elizabeth's Protestant rule was seen as illegitimate. The fact that Mary was Elizabeth's cousin only made the situation more fraught with tension. Mary, who had spent many years in England under Elizabeth's watch, had become a pawn in the larger Catholic struggle against Protestant England. Eventually, Elizabeth's decision to execute Mary after learning of her involvement in the Babington plot sealed the fate of the Catholic cause in England. The execution was a momentous and divisive decision, but it also marked the end of Mary's threat to Elizabeth's rule. Despite her triumphs and her ability to quell internal dissent, Elizabeth's reign was not without its darker moments. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, though a political necessity, was a heavy burden on Elizabeth's conscience. She had been hesitant to sign the death warrant, and the decision weighed on her for the rest of her life. The Queen, who had spent much of her reign managing political crises with remarkable calm, was now faced with the emotional fallout of this difficult choice. It was a reminder that even for a monarch as powerful as Elizabeth, leadership often required sacrifices, both politically and personally. As Elizabeth entered the final years of her life, her reign became increasingly fragile, her health was deteriorating, and with it, her ability to govern as she once had. Though she still retained the sharpness of mind that had allowed her to outmaneuver political rivals throughout her reign, the physical toll of age had become evident. The decline of her health, coupled with the growing pressure of the succession crisis, left England on the edge of uncertainty. Despite her efforts to maintain a firm grip on power, Elizabeth could no longer escape the reality that the end of her reign was approaching. Her last years were marked by a growing sense of inevitability. The Queen, who had once been the very picture of youthful vigour and political savvy, was now an elderly monarch surrounded by courtiers who increasingly looked to the future rather than the past. Elizabeth's ability to maintain authority in the face of mounting pressure was a testament to her resilience, but it also highlighted the difficult decisions she had to make in order to preserve the legacy she had built. As her death drew nearer, the the entire nation began to prepare for a future without her. When Elizabeth I finally passed away on March 24, 1603, it marked the end of an era. The political, cultural, and religious shifts she had engineered over her reign left an indelible mark on England. While the question of succession remained a dark cloud over her final years, Elizabeth's death led to the peaceful transition of power to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, uniting the two crowns. The legacy of her rule, however, would not be easily forgotten. Under Elizabeth's leadership, England had grown into a major global power. Her personal triumphs, political wisdom, and strategic foresight were deeply embedded in the national consciousness, and the Virgin Queen would forever remain a symbol of England's strength, resilience, and independence. As Elizabeth I's final breath drew near, the quiet, unspoken anxieties about the future of England became almost tangible. The moment was inevitable, but for the nation, the thought of a monarch so steadfast, so resolute in the face of countless challenges, slipping away was nearly unthinkable. Elizabeth had reigned for over 4 decades, long enough to make her presence feel eternal, almost like an unshakable pillar holding the very fabric of the kingdom together. Her reign was defined by constant tension, both political and personal, yet she had navigated every obstacle with unmatched poise. As the Queen's health worsened, there was a palpable sense of dread hanging over her court, and while the prospect of her death was expected, the reality of it was far more difficult to accept. In the days leading up to her passing, Elizabeth's court was an uncomfortable mix of reverence, desperation, and unspoken tension. Her final moments were accompanied by whispers about who would succeed her, and whether her carefully crafted legacy could survive beyond her. The issue of succession had loomed over her entire reign, but now it was no longer a matter of political strategy, it was a stark reality. Elizabeth, ever the shrewd strategist, had left a kingdom in a delicate balance. Her policies, her deft handling of both internal and external threats, had allowed her to maintain power against all odds, but her inability to secure a successor meant that her death would inevitably create a vacuum of leadership, one that could spark unrest if the transition wasn't handled smoothly. The decision to pass the crown to James VI of Scotland was, in many ways, a logical choice. Elizabeth's cousin James was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and through his descent from Henry VII, he had a legitimate claim to the throne. Yet despite this, Elizabeth's reluctance to name him as her successor had been a carefully considered, albeit strained manoeuvre. She had long resisted the idea of ceding power to a male monarch, particularly one who could potentially bring with him a different set of policies and allegiances. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth had used her refusal to marry as a source of power, keeping control of her court, her government, and her own fate. But as her life drew to a close, the reality of the succession question became undeniable. Elizabeth had no heirs, and the future of the monarchy, without her hand guiding it, could no longer be ignored. It is said that in her final days Elizabeth was largely withdrawn, her once sharp mind clouded by illness. Yet even in her weakened state she refused to show any sign of vulnerability. Her courtiers reported that she had moments of lucidity, speaking with the same strength and dignity that had marked her reign. Her emotional fortitude remained intact, but her physical frailty was evident. In some ways, her death was as enigmatic as her life. Her transition from this world to the next was as quiet as her ability to navigate the storms of court intrigue and international politics. Yet her legacy, solidified through her exceptional leadership and her deft handling of the most complex matters, would not fade with her passing. When Elizabeth finally died, it was as though the entire country held its breath. For some, her death was a moment of loss, not just for her, but for an entire era. For others, her passing marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that brought with it uncertainty, but also the hope of continuity. Her funeral, like her reign, was a magnificent affair, full of ceremony and reverence. Elizabeth was laid to rest beside her sister Mary in Westminster Abbey, her burial symbolising the end of the Tudor dynasty and the beginning of the Stuart era. While this transition marked the end of one royal line, Elizabeth's influence was felt far beyond the immediate political ramifications. James I, now crowned after Elizabeth's death, ascended to the throne of England, uniting the crowns of Scotland and England for the first time. Yet despite his legitimate claim, James could never fully escape the shadow of Elizabeth's reign. The Elizabethan age had redefined England's place in the world. and as much as James sought to carve out his own path, the legacy of his cousin loomed large over his rule. Elizabeth had set the stage for England's rise as a major European power, and James inherited not only a kingdom, but also the expectations that came with it. Elizabeth's handling of the crown, her protection of England's sovereignty, and her commitment to the arts had established a solid foundation for the future. Still, the contrast between the two monarchs was clear. Where Elizabeth had ruled with tact and subtlety, James often leaned toward a more direct approach, which sometimes led to conflict with his subjects and Parliament. Despite the passing of time, the memory of Elizabeth's reign would persist as an idealised period of English history. The cultural flourishing of her reign, the plays of Shakespeare, the voyages of Drake and Raleigh, the advancement of English art and literature, continued to shape English identity. Even in James's reign, the works of the Elizabethan era remained central to English cultural life. The influence of Elizabeth I continued to be felt in both domestic and foreign policy, with England retaining its position as a powerful nation in Europe. The effects of her reign also extended to the English colonies that were being established across the Atlantic. Elizabeth's decision to support exploration laid the groundwork for the eventual expansion of the British Empire, which would come to define global politics in the centuries to follow. While Elizabeth may not have left behind a direct heir, she had left something far more lasting, a model of strong, stable governance in the face of adversity. Her ability to maintain her kingdom in a time of religious and political division was a testament to her skill and wisdom as a ruler. She knew when to act and when to let the winds of fortune blow in her favour. Her reign may have ended with the passing of her body, but her spirit, her intelligence, and her legacy would continue to shape England for generations. Elizabeth's rise from the uncertain, illegitimate daughter of Anne Boleyn to one of the most powerful and respected monarchs in English history is nothing short of extraordinary. She was a queen who'd been forced to survive in a world of men, to outwit rivals and to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics, all while maintaining an air of grace, dignity, and quiet strength. Her ability to weather the storms of her time made her not just a queen, but a symbol of England's resilience and power. And even though she passed from the world in 1603, Elizabeth I remains one of history's most remarkable figures, forever etched in the pages of history as a queen who defined an era. In the centuries following Elizabeth's death, her reign continued to serve as a model for strong, pragmatic leadership. Her legacy as a monarch who deftly navigated complex religious, political and social challenges without ever losing her grip on power is deeply ingrained in England's national consciousness. Elizabeth was, in many ways, the embodiment of the nation's resilience, a queen who had pulled England out of the shadows of dynastic uncertainty, established it as a global power, and created an atmosphere of cultural and artistic flourishing that resonated long after her passing. As the centuries passed, her reign was romanticised, her decisions dissected, and her figure idolised. The myth surrounding Elizabeth grew as much as her accomplishments, and she was often viewed not only as a political genius, but as a symbol of England's unyielding strength in the face of adversity. Her death, though it marked the end of the Tudor dynasty, was not the end of the cultural and historical impact of her reign. Under Elizabeth, England had undergone a transformation that set the stage for its dominance in the world. The arts, exploration, and military victories that defined her time left an indelible mark on the nation. The country had experienced a renaissance during her rule, one that would echo through English history. Elizabeth's diplomatic strategies had not only preserved her throne, but also ensured that England had a significant role to play on the world stage for centuries to come. The Elizabethan age was an era of innovation, not only in art, but also in exploration. The voyages of Sir Francis Drake, Walter Raleigh, and other explorers would lay the foundation for the British Empire. England's sea power was solidified during Elizabeth's reign, and in the years to come, the navy she had strengthened would become the force that allowed the British to dominate the world's oceans. The spread of English influence around the globe was one of the most lasting effects of Elizabeth's leadership, and her decisions to back exploration had established the groundwork for future colonisation and trade. England's ascendancy on the global stage was built upon the stability she created at home and the connection she forged abroad. Moreover, Elizabeth's reign also marked the beginning of England's involvement in a new era of scientific discovery and intellectual exploration. Though her reign saw little direct involvement in the scientific revolution, it was under her watch that figures like Sir Francis Bacon and other early intellectuals began to challenge conventional thinking. Bacon's work on the empirical method and his push for scientific inquiry was a precursor to the advancements that would come in the centuries after Elizabeth's death. The intellectual spirit that she encouraged in her court and the freedom with which thinkers could operate paved the way for England's later contributions to philosophy, science, and thought. Domestically, Elizabeth's reign had also created a more unified England. Under her leadership, England moved past the divisions that had previously plagued it. The religious conflicts that had racked the kingdom, especially between Catholics and Protestants, were brought under a relatively peaceful framework through the Elizabethan religious settlement. This clever balance allowed for religious tolerance while keeping Catholic extremism in check, all while securing Protestantism as the state religion. The careful handling of religious issues helped avert the kind of civil unrest that had plagued other European countries, ensuring that Elizabeth's England remained relatively stable through a period of great external pressure. Elizabeth's legacy also shaped the political structure of England in ways that extended far beyond her death. The absolute power she held, despite being a monarch, was constantly balanced by the realities of a growing parliament and a rising middle class. While Elizabeth skillfully managed her parliament and avoided the overt conflicts between monarch and legislative bodies that would later define the Stuart period, she laid the groundwork for the eventual English Civil War. Her ability to balance power, however, meant that she could avoid many of the pitfalls that led to the downfall of later rulers. Under Elizabeth, Parliament became a more prominent body representing the increasing influence of the people, and though she never ceded the ultimate authority, her reign marked the beginning of England's slow, incremental evolution toward a constitutional monarchy. Internationally, the death of Elizabeth marked the beginning of the Stuart era under her cousin James I. Although he inherited a strong, stable kingdom, the expectations placed on him as Elizabeth's successor were enormous. Where Elizabeth had been a symbol of unity and steadfastness, James would struggle to manage both the religious tensions and the political intricacies that Elizabeth had mastered. His reign, though successful in some respects, highlighted just how much of a stabilising force Elizabeth had been. As James worked to consolidate his rule, the shadow of Elizabeth's power loomed large, and he could never quite replicate the same balance of diplomacy, power, and cultural influence that had defined her leadership. In addition to the political and cultural legacies, Elizabeth I's death symbolised the passing of an era. The transition from the Tudors to the Stuarts was not just a change of monarchs, it was the closing of one of the most vibrant chapters in English history. The political landscape, the courts, the arts, and the international alliances all reflected the age of Elizabeth, a time when England stood proud, independent, and powerful. Her reign was not without flaws, but in the context of her time, Elizabeth was a monarch who knew how to balance the tides of change and the demands of her people. For centuries after her passing, the story of Elizabeth I would continue to be told, not only in history books but in the hearts of her people. She had risen from the unlikeliest of positions, an illegitimate daughter of a volatile monarch, and ascended to become one of the most iconic figures in world history. Her rise to power was remarkable, and the way she ruled was even more so. With unparalleled intelligence, political savvy, and a fierce determination to protect her realm, Elizabeth I became a monarch whose legacy would live on forever, not just in the pages of history, but in the very identity of England itself. As the world moved forward, the image of the Virgin Queen, the wise and indomitable ruler who had made England great, remained an emblem of what a nation could achieve under the guidance of a monarch who placed the needs of her people above all else. Elizabeth's reign, despite its eventual end, would live on as a beacon of political acumen, strength, and cultural greatness that still resonates in the world today. Elizabeth I's death in 1603 marked a moment of profound transition not only for England, but for the entire landscape of European politics. The legacy she left behind, however, was not solely confined to her policies, military victories, or cultural renaissance. The Queen's leadership had shaped the national psyche in such a way that the very idea of the monarchy was forever altered. In many respects, Elizabeth had turned the concept of kingship into something more than a mere political role. She had transformed it into a symbol of national unity, strength, and identity. Her reign, defined by her personal touch, had cultivated an aura around her that would persist long after her death. Under Elizabeth, England became more than a kingdom. It became an idea, a force in the world. This was a kingdom that had stood resilient against the Spanish threat, a realm that had embraced a new religious identity, and a nation that had begun to push the boundaries of art, literature, and exploration. Yet, despite the grandeur of her rule, Elizabeth's greatest gift to England was the sense of stability and pride she instilled. For over 40 years, her rule had been a constant amidst the storms of internal strife and external threats. Her refusal to marry, her careful handling of the throne, and her ability to adapt to changing circumstances ensured that England endured and thrived even when the odds seemed insurmountable. As James I ascended to the throne, the English people found themselves in uncharted waters. The monarchy had shifted from the Tudors to the Stuarts, and the court dynamics changed almost overnight. James, though he inherited a kingdom in relative peace, faced the impossible task of stepping into Elizabeth's shoes. His approach to governance, both in terms of his relationship with Parliament and his foreign policy, differed drastically from Elizabeth's. Where she had been cautious, politically astute, and able to work with the complexities of her court, James was far more open about his divine right to rule. This difference in style would ultimately lead to tensions between the monarchy and Parliament, setting the stage for future conflicts that would culminate in the English Civil War. Despite the differences in their rule, James I inherited much more than just a throne. He inherited the immense expectation that England, under his watch, would continue to be the global power Elizabeth had built. The question of succession, which had so weighed on Elizabeth's mind, was now firmly in his hands. The uncertainty that had defined the latter years of Elizabeth's reign was now replaced by the relative certainty of a Stuart monarch. Yet in some ways, the very stability Elizabeth had crafted now left a legacy of pressure for her successor. The world that Elizabeth had left James was vastly different from the one she had inherited, and while she had laid a solid foundation, it would take a monarch of exceptional skill to manage the empire and maintain peace at home. Her death also marked the end of the Tudor dynasty, which had defined England for over a century. The Tudors had reshaped England's destiny, and the bloodline that had started with Henry VII's victory at Bosworth had, by the time of Elizabeth's death, established a thriving Protestant nation. The iconic portraits of Elizabeth, her regal posture and majestic attire, had come to symbolise an entire era. Her passing felt like the closing of a remarkable chapter in English history, yet it also set the stage for the rise of a new chapter, one with its own challenges and uncertainties. The transition from Elizabeth to James was not one of smooth continuation, but of marked differences, both in personality and in style. Elizabeth's careful, diplomatic reign gave way to James's more autocratic style, and the political tension this created would reverberate throughout his reign. Yet, despite the political tensions and the differences between the monarchs, Elizabeth's influence remained. Her policies, though never formally codified as law, continued to shape the direction of the English monarchy. James inherited the foundations of a powerful Protestant nation, one that was beginning to establish itself as an imperial force. The defeat of the Spanish Armada and England's growing colonial ambitions were symbols of Elizabeth's strategic foresight, and James, for all his differences, continued to build on that foundation. While the personal and political legacy of the Tudor Queen remained a potent force, it was also clear that the world was changing and the challenges of the 17th century would demand a new kind of leadership. Elizabeth's death also brought a sense of finality to her remarkable rise from an uncertain, often precarious childhood to one of the most respected and powerful rulers in European history. Born the daughter of a controversial marriage and declared illegitimate by her father, Elizabeth's early years had been marked by hardship, political instability, and an absence of clear support. Yet she had turned that uncertainty into an advantage. Her life had been one of survival as she carefully navigated the complexities of court politics, religious upheaval, and foreign threats. From the time she was a princess with little hope of the throne, Elizabeth had learned the skills that would make her one of history's greatest monarchs. She had witnessed the downfall of both her mother and her half-sister, and had learned the delicate balance between power and vulnerability. Her ability to maintain control over her court while simultaneously deflecting the pressures of marriage and succession was a testament to her political acumen. The fact that she was able to reign for so long without a clear heir in place speaks to her ability to manage both her own ambitions and the expectations of her people. Throughout her reign, she was both a mother to her people and a steadfast defender of the crown. Her image as the Virgin Queen became a cornerstone of her reign, and the notion of being married to her kingdom allowed her to avoid the political entanglements that might have otherwise undermined her authority. Though Elizabeth I's death signalled the end of one era, her legacy endured. Her reign had altered the course of English history, ensuring that the nation would rise to become one of the world's great powers. In every aspect of English society, from its arts to its global influence to its national identity, Elizabeth's hand had been felt. Even centuries after her passing, Elizabeth I continued to serve as a touchstone for future generations of monarchs, a queen whose blend of diplomacy, strength, and wisdom had forged an empire. As the decades passed, the memory of Elizabeth IV's reign remained deeply ingrained in England's national consciousness, and her legacy continued to influence both the monarchy and the cultural identity of the English people. Despite the challenges and differences faced by her successor, James I, the imprint of Elizabeth's rule remained a benchmark for future monarchs. James's reign, with its tension-filled relationship with Parliament and his struggles with religious tensions, stood in stark contrast to the calm, composed leadership Elizabeth had exhibited throughout her reign. Where she had been a master of diplomacy and compromise, James was more assertive, even authoritarian, in his approach to governance. Yet, as different as their reigns were, they shared one fundamental similarity. Both monarchs inherited and had to navigate the immense weight of Elizabeth's influence. Her reign had set a high bar for English monarchy. Elizabeth was not only a queen, but a symbol of what England could achieve. Her legacy was not limited to military victories like the defeat of the Spanish Armada, though it certainly played a crucial role in securing England's standing as a military power. She was also a symbol of cultural flourishing. The arts, literature, and theatre all reached new heights during her rule, thanks to Elizabeth's patronage of the arts and her recognition of the potential of playwrights, poets, and artists. Shakespeare's works, the burgeoning English theatre, and the poetry of Edmund Spenser flourished under her rule, forever shaping England's contribution to global cultural heritage. Moreover, Elizabeth's careful balance between Protestantism and Catholicism helped avoid the sectarian bloodshed that ravaged other parts of Europe during the Reformation. Her religious settlement, though not without its critics, provided a relatively peaceful coexistence between the two factions in England and laid the groundwork for the Church of England's enduring place in English life. She had been a unifier at a time when Europe was fractured by religious conflict, and this aspect of her reign became a touchstone for future monarchs seeking to unite a deeply divided nation. However, the question of succession remained a point of contention and uncertainty throughout her reign, and it continued to shape the monarchy even after her death. Though Elizabeth had been steadfast in her refusal to marry or name a successor, it was clear to all that the issue of the crown's inheritance could no longer be ignored. Her death in 1603 led to the peaceful ascension of James I, but the lack of a direct heir had left a lingering sense of unease. In many ways, James inherited the Tudor legacy, but he also inherited the unresolved tension surrounding the monarchy's future. The union of the crowns of England and Scotland under James I was one of the most significant political events of the early 17th century, but it was also emblematic of the challenges of succession in the wake of Elizabeth's reign. The unification of the two realms represented both an opportunity for political stability and a potential source of tension. While Elizabeth had been able to maintain a fragile peace between England and Scotland, her death meant that James I now had to manage the political and religious divisions within his own kingdom, particularly in a time of growing Protestant-Catholic conflict across Europe. James's attempts to integrate Scotland and England under his rule were often met with resistance, particularly from English Parliament and the English court, where James's Scottish background was seen as a liability. This tension between monarch and parliament continued to evolve over the next several decades, ultimately contributing to the English Civil War and the execution of Charles I, James's son, in 1649. It's fascinating to think how Elizabeth's reign, though successful in so many ways, had set the stage for such a turbulent political future. Her refusal to address the question of succession and her careful manipulation of the court to maintain stability had, in some ways, created a volatile environment for her successors. While Elizabeth's leadership had brought England unparalleled power and stability, it also left unresolved questions that would ultimately contribute to political upheaval in the century that followed. Despite the turmoil that followed her death, Elizabeth I had remained a central figure in the narrative of English history. In many ways, her reign had been a golden age for England, a time of artistic flourishing, military triumph and national pride. Elizabeth was the personification of a confident, united England, and her leadership represented the idea that a single, strong ruler could transform a divided nation into a global power. Even as England moved into a new era under the Stuarts, Elizabeth's shadow loomed large over the monarchy and over the national identity that had been forged under her reign. Her reign, though not without its flaws, had demonstrated the power of strong, principled leadership. Elizabeth had come to the throne as a young woman without a secure place in the royal family, and had navigated a world filled with intrigue, betrayal, and external threats. Yet through it all, she had managed to steer England through some of the most difficult periods in its history. By the time of her death, she had successfully united the nation, built a cultural and artistic legacy that would endure for centuries, and ensured that England would emerge as a world power. As historians look back on Elizabeth's life, there is no question that she stands as one of the most remarkable rulers in history. Her ability to transform the monarchy, to navigate the complex politics of her time, and to leave a lasting cultural legacy is a testament to her intelligence, resilience, and leadership. Elizabeth's life and reign were not just the story of a woman who ruled a kingdom, they were the story of a monarch who redefined what it meant to lead, and whose legacy would resonate through the centuries to come. Even as her physical presence faded from the world, Elizabeth I's influence remained a vital and enduring force in the history of England and the world at large. Elizabeth I's impact on the course of history continued to ripple through England long after her death, shaping the political, cultural, and religious landscapes of the nation for generations. As her legacy lived on, the England she had crafted, one marked by cultural prosperity, military strength, and religious stability, stood in sharp contrast to the stormy political future that would follow under her successor, James I. While Elizabeth's reign had been characterised by a careful balance of power, diplomacy, and religious compromise, her passing left a monarch who faced a different set of challenges. The unification of the crowns under James brought together England and Scotland, but it also introduced a host of complications that would shape English history in unexpected ways. One of the most significant effects of Elizabeth's reign was the establishment of a powerful English navy. Elizabeth had understood the importance of sea power, both as a defence against foreign invasion and as a means of expanding English influence across the globe. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 had not only protected England from Catholic domination, but also bolstered the reputation of England as a naval superpower. The English navy under her direction had become one of the most formidable in the world. However, following Elizabeth's death, her successor, James I, would find himself in a precarious position as tensions with Spain were never fully resolved, and the military focus of the Tudor era gave way to the political and personal struggles of the Stuart monarchy. James's reign, though starting with the peaceful union of the English and Scottish crowns, was increasingly characterised by political struggles that Elizabeth had managed to avoid. The English throne had shifted from one of pragmatic leadership to one of greater absolutism. While Elizabeth had carefully worked with her parliament, James, who believed in the divine right of kings, attempted to assert more authority over the monarchy, which led to growing tensions with both Parliament and the English people. This shift in governance was partly a reaction to Elizabeth's long reign, which had relied heavily on the cooperation of her advisers and the support of Parliament. James's more autocratic approach, however, set the stage for years of political conflict, culminating in the English Civil War in the 1640s, which would further cement the division between the monarchy and Parliament. The political divisions that arose during James's reign were not merely the result of his own leadership style, but also of the religious tensions that Elizabeth had carefully managed throughout her rule. While Elizabeth's religious settlement had established Protestantism as the official religion of England, her tolerance toward Catholics was always an underlying fragile piece. The post-Reformation world in which Elizabeth reigned was filled with religious upheaval across Europe, and Elizabeth's skillful navigation of these conflicts had kept her kingdom relatively stable. Yet with her death, the balance she had struck between the Catholics and Protestants began to unravel. James's efforts to unify both the Church of England and Catholic factions within England proved to be difficult and unsuccessful, which led to heightened tensions between the Protestant majority and the Catholic minority. Perhaps one of the most profound aspects of Elizabeth's reign was her influence on the cultural development of England. The Elizabethan era is often remembered as a period of great literary and artistic achievement. The works of Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Spenser were products of a time when the arts flourished under the protection of a monarch who understood the importance of cultural development in reinforcing national identity. Elizabeth, who was both a patron of the arts and a queen deeply involved in matters of national culture, recognised that literature and the theatre could serve as powerful tools for expressing the values of her reign. The public theatre, which became immensely popular during her rule, was a reflection of her commitment to the growth of English arts and the dissemination of ideas. James I, thus, though a supporter of the arts, could not fully capture the spirit of the Elizabethan age. His reign marked a shift in both the political and cultural climate of England. While the theatre continued to flourish under James's patronage, the intellectual and artistic innovations that had been at their peak under Elizabeth started to slow. Elizabeth's reign had given rise to the golden age of English drama, where playwrights like Shakespeare were able to write with remarkable freedom. By contrast, James's rule was marked by growing censorship and less tolerance for certain forms of artistic expression. The arts, which had been so central to Elizabeth's reign, began to lose the vibrant energy they had once had, as the monarchy became more conservative and less engaged with the intellectual flourishing of the Elizabethan period. The political and cultural shifts following Elizabeth's death were compounded by the growing influence of the English Parliament, which began to assert more power as the monarchy sought to reclaim authority. Elizabeth had managed to maintain her power by using her political astuteness and by aligning herself with her advisors, but as the Stuart kings sought to strengthen royal prerogative, the divide between monarchy and parliament grew. Elizabeth's reign had seen a balance of power between monarch and parliament that allowed her to rule with relative ease, but this delicate equilibrium began to fracture under her successors. By the time of James's son, Charles I, this tension would reach its breaking point, leading to the civil war that would challenge the monarchy's absolute authority. Despite these challenges, Elizabeth's death marked the end of a transformative period in English history, and the changes that followed in the centuries to come were shaped in part by the foundations she had laid. Elizabeth had skillfully navigated a world that seemed to conspire against her, from her own family's political intrigues to foreign powers seeking to undermine her rule. Yet she had always managed to steer England through the storm, and by the time of her death, England had become a formidable power on the European stage. Her ability to hold together a divided kingdom, while expanding its influence in the world, ensured that her reign would be remembered as one of England's greatest. Even as England moved into a new era under the Stuarts, the legacy of Elizabeth I would continue to resonate for centuries, providing both inspiration and caution to the monarchs who followed. Elizabeth's reign, filled with triumphs and hardships, proved that a nation could rise above its struggles when led by a ruler with a steady hand and a clear vision. And although her direct descendants would not carry her legacy into the future, Elizabeth I, the first imprint on England, remained unshaken. The queen who had risen from the ashes of political turmoil, who had built England into an empire, and who had led with intelligence, wit and unparalleled grace, remained a central figure in the history of her nation, forever regarded as one of the greatest monarchs to have ever lived. The death of Elizabeth I did not just mark the end of the Tudor dynasty, but also the end of an era of England's grand political unity and cultural ascendancy. For the nation, the Elizabethan age had been a time of pride and achievement, a period that built the foundation for England's place in the modern world. Yet, as the country entered the 17th century under the rule of James I, it became clear that the legacy of Elizabeth's reign would continue to influence both the course of English politics and the national identity, though in ways that would often be complicated and fraught with conflict. James, inheriting both England and Scotland, quickly found himself at odds with many of the established norms that Elizabeth had carefully cultivated. While she had been a master of balance and diplomacy, James was far more assertive in his approach to royal authority, believing firmly in the divine right of kings. His belief that the monarch held supreme power led to mounting tensions with Parliament, an institution that had gained increasing influence during Elizabeth's rule. James's autocratic inclinations, compounded by his Scottish background, placed him in a delicate political position. While Elizabeth had managed to keep the monarchy and Parliament on a relatively even keel, James's overconfidence in his divine right to rule alienated many who had grown accustomed to a more collaborative relationship with the crown. The result was a tension that would grow over the next several decades. The friction between monarch and Parliament became particularly pronounced under James's son, Charles I, whose struggles with Parliament would eventually lead to the English Civil War. In many ways, the transition from the careful governance of Elizabeth to the more confrontational approach of the Stuarts was a catalyst for the long-brewing conflict. James, though intelligent and capable in his own right, struggled to understand the balance of power that Elizabeth had so artfully maintained. This shift in the dynamics of the monarchy would go on to affect not just England's internal politics, but its role on the global stage. While James and his son Charles would face a multitude of political challenges, Elizabeth's reign remained a constant point of reference. The model of Elizabethan diplomacy, her handling of both domestic affairs and international relations, and her extraordinary ability to project both strength and vulnerability, were attributes that set her apart from many monarchs who followed. Her reign had been an exercise in balancing various interests, religious factions, foreign policy, and the demands of her court, while ensuring that her authority was never in question. In the decades after her death, monarchs often looked to Elizabeth as a symbol of what good governance could achieve, but they also realised how difficult it was to replicate her approach. She had managed to navigate a complex and turbulent era, not just surviving but thriving, and her successors had a difficult time filling the shoes of a monarch who had, by all accounts, mastered the art of rule. Elizabeth's legacy also endured through the cultural and intellectual movements she had fostered. Her patronage of the arts, particularly the theatre, transformed England into a cultural powerhouse, and the writers and artists who flourished during her reign would continue to inspire generations. The works of Shakespeare, Marlowe, and others from this golden age of English literature would go on to define the artistic vision of not just England, but the entire Western world. Elizabeth's court had been a centre of creativity, and her support for the arts had given birth to some of the most iconic cultural achievements in history. Yet in the wake of her death, the cultural momentum she had sparked began to slow, as the Stuart kings, particularly James I, were less engaged with the artistic and intellectual movements of the time. While James continued to support playwrights and poets, his reign was marked by a more conservative approach, and the intellectual and artistic vibrancy that had characterised Elizabeth's reign began to wane. Even as her political and cultural legacy endured, Elizabeth's image as a ruler and an icon was carefully cultivated in the years after her death. In the centuries following her reign, Elizabeth was often portrayed as a paragon of virtue and strength. Her refusal to marry and her steadfast commitment to her country made her an enduring symbol of England's resolve. The image of the Virgin Queen became central to her posthumous identity, a monarch who had remained untouchable and wholly devoted to the welfare of her people. Her image was immortalised in portraits, many of which emphasised her regal and untouchable nature, highlighting her as a symbol of both political and personal purity. Elizabeth was seen as the perfect monarch, wise, just, and unyielding. As history unfolded, her reign became a touchstone for later rulers who aspired to the same level of control and influence. Yet for all the reverence she garnered after her death, Elizabeth was not without her critics. The later generations of historians and political thinkers often questioned aspects of her reign, particularly her handling of religious tensions and the way in which she navigated the challenges of court politics. The image of Elizabeth as the perfect monarch is in many ways a myth, carefully constructed over time. While she was undeniably a remarkable ruler, her decisions were not without flaws. Some of her choices, such as the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, and her treatment of Catholic factions, have been scrutinised by historians, with many questioning whether these actions were politically necessary or overly harsh. Still, Elizabeth's legacy remained largely unchallenged in the popular imagination. She was a queen who had redefined what it meant to rule, and had left an indelible mark on the history of England. In the long term, Elizabeth I became a symbol not just of a golden age in English history, but of the potential for strong, visionary leadership in turbulent times. She had taken a fractured kingdom, marked by the religious conflict and political instability, and transformed it into a formidable force in Europe. Her reign had demonstrated the power of a monarch to shape the destiny of a nation through intelligence, charisma, and an unyielding commitment to national interests. Her rise from an uncertain childhood to one of the greatest monarchs in history was a story of resilience, vision, and unrelenting strength. And though her successors would face their own challenges, Elizabeth I's place in history remained secure as one of the most influential leaders to have ever sat upon the English throne. As time passed, Elizabeth I's legacy continued to echo throughout England, serving as both a guiding light and a cautionary tale for those who followed her. The ideal of the Virgin Queen, with her indomitable will and unparalleled leadership, was perpetuated through the ages. In the centuries following her death, Elizabeth was celebrated not just for her political accomplishments, but for the enduring cultural identity she had helped craft for England. Her reign was often viewed as a golden age in English history, a time when the nation stood strong and united, thriving in arts, exploration, and military prowess. As with all great monarchs, the reality of Elizabeth's reign was more complex than the idealised versions of her that would emerge in the centuries after her death. Elizabeth had been an extraordinary monarch in her time, but she was also deeply human. Her reign had been marked by both triumphs and tragedies, and her decision-making had not been free from flaw or controversy. Her refusal to marry, a central aspect of her persona and political strategy, had been both a source of strength and a point of vulnerability. While her independence from male influence had allowed her to consolidate power, it had also raised uncomfortable questions about her ability to secure the throne for future generations. Her inability to produce an heir, while she had no doubt hoped to avoid the fate of her predecessors, had also created a precarious vacuum that would shape the monarchy's future. The question of succession remained an unresolved issue throughout her reign, leaving the crown vulnerable to uncertainty after her death. Moreover, Elizabeth's political decisions had not been without their critics. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1587 was one of the most controversial acts of her reign. While politically necessary to eliminate a Catholic rival who had plotted against her throne, the execution was viewed by many as a deeply personal and ultimately harsh act. It signalled the lengths to which Elizabeth would go to ensure her rule, but it also complicated her relationship with Catholic Europe and led to a backlash from Spain, which would continue to shape English foreign policy for years. Similarly, her handling of the Catholic problem in England was a double-edged sword. While her moderate approach had helped to avoid widespread violence and rebellion, it also left unresolved tensions that would later come to the forefront during the reigns of her successors, particularly when the pressures of religious conflict began to overwhelm the monarchy. Still, Elizabeth's ability to unite a fractured kingdom and transform England into one of Europe's most formidable powers was a remarkable achievement. She had managed to carve out a place for England in a world dominated by more powerful Catholic monarchies, and her strategic alliances, whether through diplomacy, marriage proposals, or military engagement, had secured England's future. Under her leadership, the Protestant Reformation had taken firm root in ensuring that England would remain Protestant, while simultaneously navigating the complex relationship with Catholic powers. Elizabeth had maintained this delicate balance for decades, never fully alienating one side while consolidating her own power. Her success in this area allowed England to prosper, but it also left behind a legacy of religious division that would challenge her successors. As the 17th century unfolded, it became evident that Elizabeth's approach to governance, marked by shrewd political manoeuvring and a deep understanding of both domestic and international dynamics, was not easily replicated. James I, her successor, would face numerous challenges, both politically and religiously. His belief in the divine right of kings, a view that sharply contrasted with Elizabeth's more balanced approach to power, contributed to a growing rift between the monarchy and Parliament. While Elizabeth had maintained a certain level of cooperation with her Parliament, James attempted to assert more control, resulting in a series of conflicts that would eventually culminate in the English Civil War. In hindsight, it was clear that Elizabeth's reign had set a precedent for the delicate relationship between monarchy and governance. Her death left a void that was difficult to fill, and her successors found themselves struggling to maintain the same level of national unity and stability. Despite the political turmoil that followed her death, Elizabeth's reign continued to inspire and influence the course of English history. Her diplomatic acumen, her firm control over the monarchy, and her strategic management of both internal and external threats ensured that her rule was a model for later monarchs. Even as her successors faced greater challenges, her influence endured as a touchstone for future leaders. Elizabeth had set a high bar for what it meant to be a monarch, and though her successors struggled to live up to her legacy, they were continually compared to her. In the centuries that followed, Elizabeth became a symbol of England's national pride and identity. Her reign was seen as the culmination of England's emergence as a global power, one that would continue to grow throughout the colonial period and into the 19th century. Elizabeth had laid the foundation for the English Empire, and her success in establishing England as a major player on the world stage would resonate throughout history. Her legacy, both as a monarch and as a cultural icon, would shape not just the politics of her time, but the very identity of England itself. Elizabeth's influence extended far beyond her death. Her image as a ruler who had successfully navigated the complexities of her time, securing England's position in the world, became deeply embedded in English national consciousness. Her reign was celebrated for its military victories, its cultural flourishing, and its ability to unite a divided nation. In the centuries to come, historians would continue to look back on her reign as a time when England had been at the height of its power, and Elizabeth herself would be regarded as one of the most capable and visionary monarchs to have ever lived. Even in the modern era, Elizabeth I remains one of the most revered figures in English history. Her legacy continues to shape the ways in which we think about leadership, diplomacy, and the role of the monarch in national governance. Elizabeth's extraordinary rise to power, from the uncertain daughter of Anne Boleyn to the reigning monarch who would lead England into the Golden Age, remains a testament to her resilience, intellect, and enduring influence. The story of her reign, filled with triumphs and challenges, is one that continues to inspire and educate, offering valuable lessons about the complexities of power, the importance of vision, and the lasting impact of strong leadership. Even centuries after her death, Elizabeth IV's legacy remained as vibrant and impactful as ever, shaping both the cultural and political landscape of England for generations. While the political upheaval that followed her passing, particularly during the reign of James I and his successors, seemed to challenge the stability she had worked so hard to establish, it was clear that her influence continued to permeate every corner of English society. The very notion of the English monarchy, its role in the world, and its relationship with the people had been irrevocably altered by Elizabeth's reign. Her careful blend of intelligence, political savvy, and personal charisma made her a model of leadership, one that future monarchs would both admire and attempt to emulate. Yet as the years went by, Elizabeth's reign was seen less as a model to follow and more as a golden age, an unattainable ideal that loomed over England's future rulers. Elizabeth had been more than just a monarch. She had become the embodiment of England itself. The way in which she navigated religious, political, and cultural divides within her kingdom, all while managing the growing pressures of foreign relations, set a precedent for what effective leadership could look like. Her unique ability to blend diplomacy with authority made her one of the most successful rulers in history, and this was something that could not easily be replicated. Her reign was not without its challenges, but she had always emerged victorious time and time again. In the wake of her death, England found itself faced with the reality that no monarch would quite live up to Elizabeth's legacy. James I, though competent, lacked her political finesse and ability to maintain such delicate balances of power. Perhaps the most profound shift that Elizabeth's death ushered in was the changing nature of the monarchy. James I's belief in the divine right of kings stood in stark contrast to the model Elizabeth had created, one where, although absolute power still lay with the crown, there was an intricate dance between the monarch and parliament. Elizabeth had understood that while she ultimately wielded supreme authority, the art of governance required listening to, and sometimes compromising with, those around her. James, on the other hand, believed that his right to rule was granted by God alone, and he was less inclined to involve Parliament in decision-making. This approach would quickly cause tensions, and it was during the reign of his son Charles I that the monarchy's refusal to acknowledge the growing power of Parliament would lead to outright civil conflict. The notion of kingship, so defined by Elizabeth's careful balance, was now in danger of being pulled apart by the very forces that Elizabeth had expertly controlled. Elizabeth's reign had also seen the rise of the English navy, and with it the nation's status as a formidable naval power. Her brilliant handling of the Spanish Armada, which had long been a symbol of England's strength, had set the tone for England's imperial ambitions. Yet in the years following her death, the navy that Elizabeth had built was left to flounder under less capable leadership. The political struggles of her successors, combined with the rising tensions with Spain, took a toll on the naval prowess she had worked so hard to establish. Even as England began to expand its influence across the globe, particularly through exploration and colonisation, it was clear that Elizabeth's ability to manage foreign relations and maintain a strong military presence was something that few could match. Culturally, however, Elizabeth's influence remained undeniable. The arts flourished under her reign, and her patronage of playwrights, poets, and musicians had turned England into a cultural hub. Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Spenser had produced works that would stand the test of time, and the development of English drama and literature during the Elizabethan era is still regarded as one of the most significant cultural movements in history. While James I continued to support the arts, he could never fully replicate the same level of excitement and creativity that had been present under Elizabeth's rule. Her court, which had been a centre for intellectual exchange and cultural innovation, had created an atmosphere where artists and writers felt free to experiment and push boundaries. Under the Stuarts, however, there was a notable shift toward greater censorship, and the vibrancy that had defined Elizabethan culture began to diminish. Perhaps one of the most enduring aspects of Elizabeth's legacy was her ability to command respect and inspire devotion, not only among her court but among the people of England. Her public persona was carefully constructed to reflect the strength and unity of her reign, and this image became central to the English identity. Even after her death, Elizabeth was seen as a symbol of national pride, with the idealised image of the Virgin Queen representing the very best of England. As history progressed, Elizabeth's reign became mythologised, and she was celebrated as a monarch who had led her country to greatness. Yet, despite the idealised portrayals, Elizabeth's reign had been far from perfect. Her decisions were often driven by pragmatism, and not every choice she made had a happy outcome. However, it was her ability to navigate the complexities of both her time and her personal life that allowed her to secure her place in history. In the centuries following her death, Elizabeth continued to inspire political leaders, artists and thinkers alike. Her political savvy and diplomatic genius served as a model for future leaders, and her reign became a benchmark against which subsequent monarchs were measured. Elizabeth's life and legacy became a story of triumph over adversity, a tale of a woman who rose from the uncertainties of her birth to become one of the most influential rulers the world has ever known. Her reign proved that a kingdom could thrive under the guidance of a strong and capable monarch, and it demonstrated that with the right balance of authority and diplomacy, even a nation torn by division and turmoil could find unity. For England, Elizabeth I was not just a monarch, she was an institution. She had created a model of governance and national identity that endured long after her death. Her impact was not just felt in the political and cultural spheres, but also in the very soul of the nation. Elizabeth had shaped the destiny of England, and her legacy would forever be etched into the nation's history, providing inspiration and guidance for future generations. Elizabeth I's reign stands as a monument to the idea of monarchy as both a political and cultural force. Her ability to transform a divided, unstable kingdom into a powerful, unified nation is a testament to her extraordinary leadership. But what made Elizabeth truly remarkable was not just her political acumen or her military successes, it was the personal qualities that set her apart. She was a woman who ruled not only with her intellect, but with an unmatched emotional intelligence. Elizabeth understood the delicate balance between power and perception, and she used that understanding to navigate the complexities of court politics, international relations and religious tensions. This ability to command authority while maintaining the loyalty and affection of her people, even when faced with seemingly insurmountable odds, was key to her success. After her death, the world saw the continuation of the English monarchy, but the monumental change in leadership under James I made clear just how unique Elizabeth's reign had been. While James inherited a powerful kingdom, the unity and political finesse that Elizabeth had cultivated were not easily replicated. Her rule had been marked by her unwavering strength in the face of religious and political challenges, a strength that had allowed her to steer England through periods of conflict, both internal and external. Yet her approach to governance was not one of brute force. It was a careful, calculated diplomacy that ensured England remained both sovereign and respected on the world stage. Her successors would struggle with the balance of power she had so expertly managed. Elizabeth's death was not just the passing of a monarch, it was the end of an entire era. Her reign had symbolised a specific moment in history, a moment when England had risen to prominence and began to build an empire that would span the globe. Under Elizabeth, England had shifted from a relatively insular nation to a burgeoning global power, setting the stage for centuries of influence in trade, politics and culture. Her death marked the end of the Tudor dynasty, but it also opened the door to the Stuart era, which would bring with it its own set of challenges, notably the tensions between monarchy and parliament that would define much of England's future political landscape. In her absence, the significance of Elizabeth's reign became even more apparent. James I, though capable, faced immediate difficulties, including his struggles with Parliament, his attempts to assert divine right, and the inherited tensions from his predecessors. These challenges made clear that Elizabeth had left behind not only an empire and a legacy of cultural achievement, but also a set of complex political dynamics that would take her successors decades to manage. Elizabeth's skill at navigating court politics, her ability to cultivate alliances, and her fierce defence of the English identity were what allowed her to weather the storms that her successors would not. The contrast between Elizabeth's balanced approach and James's more autocratic style illustrated just how unique her leadership had been. The shift from Elizabeth to James also represented a shift in England's relationship with Europe. Elizabeth had carefully fostered alliances with France, Spain, and the Netherlands, navigating the religious and political rivalries that had shaped European diplomacy for centuries. Her deft handling of foreign policy had kept England relatively secure, even as Europe was embroiled in religious wars and colonial rivalries. Under James, however, England's foreign policy began to change. His marriage to Anne of Denmark, while a personal success, did little to solidify England's position in the increasingly complex web of European alliances. The failure to effectively manage relations with Spain in particular marked a decline in the influence that Elizabeth had so carefully crafted. Despite these challenges, Elizabeth's reign continued to shape English foreign policy long after her death. Her success in defeating the Spanish Armada remained a symbol of England's defiance against Catholic powers, and the Protestant cause she championed continued to influence the political and religious outlook of the nation for generations. The defeat of the Armada was not just a military victory, but also a defining moment in English identity, demonstrating to both domestic and foreign audiences that England, under Elizabeth, was a force to be reckoned with. Her skill in combining diplomacy, military power, and religious policy had created a nation poised for global influence, and that influence would only continue to expand in the centuries following her death. Culturally, Elizabeth's reign is still celebrated as one of the most transformative periods in English history. The Elizabethan age was not just a time of military and political strength, but also a time of intellectual, artistic, and cultural renaissance. Elizabeth's patronage of the arts helped fuel the growth of English drama, literature, and music, and the works produced during this period continue to define the canon of English literature. Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Jonson, to name just a few, created some of the most iconic works in history, and their work reflected not only the political climate of their time, but also the spirit of the age, one of optimism, exploration, and boldness. In the centuries following Elizabeth's reign, the enduring influence of her cultural policies would ensure that England remained a cultural epicentre, with the legacy of her court continuing to shape English artistic expression. Yet while Elizabeth's reign is often romanticised, it is important to remember that her decisions were driven by pragmatic necessity. While she was admired for her ability to preserve England's stability, her choices often carried great personal sacrifice. Her refusal to marry, which helped her maintain political independence, was also a personal burden. Elizabeth was often portrayed as a woman who sacrificed her personal happiness for the good of the nation, and this image became central to her legacy. However, it was not just a matter of self-sacrifice. Elizabeth's reign was marked by a clear understanding that her primary duty was to her people, and she would not allow anything, including marriage, to jeopardise the future of her kingdom. Elizabeth's leadership had transformed the English monarchy and the nation itself. Her death did not diminish her legacy, but rather amplified it, as future generations reflected on the unprecedented achievements of her reign. Her influence continued to shape the English monarchy, England's role in the world, and the identity of its people. The golden age she ushered in would remain a symbol of English greatness for centuries, and Elizabeth herself would forever be remembered as one of the most extraordinary monarchs in world history. The legacy of Elizabeth I persisted far beyond her death, reverberating through English history and shaping the course of future generations. While her successors faced their own challenges, none would ever quite match the remarkable impact Elizabeth had on her country. Her reign had defined an era of strength, resilience, and cultural achievement, but her death also revealed the inherent difficulties of following a ruler of such calibre. Elizabeth had left behind not only a formidable empire and a unified nation, but a complex political and religious legacy that would continue to shape England for centuries to come. The Stuarts, inheriting a kingdom she had fortified, struggled with the same issues that Elizabeth had navigated with such grace. Tensions between monarchy and parliament, religious division, and the challenge of maintaining England's global position. One of the most pressing issues for Elizabeth's successors was the question of religious conflict. Elizabeth had skillfully managed the Protestant-Catholic divide during her reign, allowing England to find relative peace amid a continent still plagued by the religious wars. Her establishment of the Church of England had given England a distinctive religious identity, one that would serve as a foundation for her policies and for the country's stability. However, her death created a vacuum that her successors struggled to fill. James I, though Protestant, was sympathetic to Catholicism, a fact that sparked considerable unrest. The constant push and pull between the desire to maintain Protestantism as the state religion and the wish to appease Catholic factions created an unstable foundation for James's reign. His inability to replicate Elizabeth's nuanced approach to religious matters would become one of the key sources of tension between the monarchy and Parliament, and the legacy of Elizabeth's careful religious diplomacy would come into sharper focus. The political balance that Elizabeth had carefully maintained also began to unravel under the Stuarts. James's belief in the divine right of kings, his attempts to centralise power, and his disregard for Parliament's influence marked a sharp departure from Elizabeth's more measured approach. Elizabeth had understood that while she was the ultimate authority, maintaining cooperation with Parliament and listening to her advisers was key to sustaining her power. James, however, believed that his right to rule came directly from God, and saw Parliament as an obstacle to his will. This shift toward absolutism eventually created a rift between the monarchy and the people. Under his son Charles I, this rift would deepen, eventually leading to the English Civil War and the temporary overthrow of the monarchy. The political culture Elizabeth had left behind, one of mutual respect and shared power, was being slowly eroded by her successors, and England would pay the price for this shift in governance. Despite the challenges posed by her successors, Elizabeth's death marked the beginning of an era where her influence continued to loom large. Even though James I and later monarchs faced difficulties, they continued to be judged against the standards set by Elizabeth. Her reign, often idealised in retrospect, became the golden age by which future rulers were measured. Elizabeth's ability to navigate crises with poise and her remarkable resilience became a model of what leadership could achieve in the face of adversity. Her reign had elevated England to its highest position in Europe and beyond, and her legacy remained an essential part of the nation's identity. In the cultural realm, the decline of the Elizabethan Golden Age after her death was inevitable. The English Renaissance that had flourished under her reign, particularly in the theatre, was a direct result of Elizabeth's personal interest in the arts. She had understood that the arts were not merely entertainment, they were a reflection of national identity and a tool for shaping public opinion. Under her patronage, playwrights like Shakespeare had revolutionised English drama, and poets like Edmund Spenser had crafted works that embodied the aspirations of a nation on the rise. The court of Elizabeth was a vibrant centre for intellectual and artistic exchange, and the arts had flourished as a result. However, after her death, the cultural vibrancy of her reign began to fade. While James I did continue to support the arts, his reign was less engaged with the creative impulses that had defined Elizabeth's court. This shift marked the decline of the intellectual and cultural energy that had made Elizabeth's era a unique moment in English history. The shifting dynamics of English politics under the Stuarts also began to affect the global ambitions that Elizabeth had fostered. Under her reign, England had begun to explore and colonise new lands, establishing itself as a rising global power. Elizabeth's strategic support of explorers like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh had begun to lay the groundwork for what would eventually become the British Empire. She had understood the importance of maritime exploration and had invested in it, even when the risks were high. Her reign had seen the first true steps toward English expansion across the seas, and her vision for England as a dominant naval power had been realised during her lifetime. After her death, however, the expansionist energy that had characterised Elizabeth's reign began to wane. The political and financial turmoil under her successors, particularly the rising tension with Spain, limited England's ability to focus on further expansion. While the groundwork for empire building had been laid, it would take several more decades before England would achieve the vast overseas empire that had been envisioned during Elizabeth's reign. The death of Elizabeth also left a vacuum in terms of national identity. Elizabeth had come to symbolise England itself. Her image was as much a part of the national psyche as the kingdom she ruled. She was not merely a monarch, but a symbol of England's resilience and greatness. Her image as the Virgin Queen became central to the narrative of English pride and independence. She had been portrayed as untouchable, her virginity a symbol of her unblemished rule, and her death forced a reckoning with the idea of England without her. In the years following her passing, Elizabeth became more than just a historical figure. She became an ideal, the embodiment of English strength and unity. While James I struggled to live up to her example, his reign could not fully erase the memory of the Elizabethan age, an era when England had stood at the height of its powers. Yet the very challenges faced by James I and his successors served to highlight the extraordinary nature of Elizabeth's rule. She had navigated political strife, religious conflict, and foreign threats with a deftness that few monarchs could match. Her reign had been defined by its balance and its ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Even though her death marked the end of the Tudor dynasty, Elizabeth's influence remained a guiding force in the history of England, her name forever tied to the idea of a strong, independent and unified nation. As the years passed and England navigated the tumultuous periods following Elizabeth I's death, the enduring influence of her reign became clearer. Her successor, James I, inherited not just a kingdom, but a symbol of unity and strength that Elizabeth had crafted through her masterful diplomacy, religious compromise and cultural patronage. James, however, quickly realised that stepping into the shoes of such an iconic figure was no small task. While he was well versed in the intricacies of Scottish politics, the English court, shaped by Elizabeth's reign, posed new challenges that he struggled to address. One of the first areas where Elizabeth's shadow loomed large was in the relationship between the monarchy and Parliament. Elizabeth had established a delicate balance between royal authority and the growing power of Parliament, skillfully managing the tensions between the two. Her reign had exemplified a system where, while the monarch held ultimate power, the cooperation of Parliament was often sought to ensure stability and the smooth running of government. In contrast, James's belief in the divine right of kings led him to approach Parliament with a more authoritarian attitude. His insistence on the absolute power of the monarchy alienated many in the English political establishment, setting the stage for a conflict that would intensify during the reign of his son, Charles I. James's autocratic tendencies, coupled with his inability to fully understand the intricacies of the English political system, created significant friction. His refusal to compromise with Parliament on matters of taxation, religion and royal prerogative eroded the cooperative spirit that had defined Elizabeth's relationship with her government. While Elizabeth had been a pragmatist who understood the necessity of political negotiation, James's approach was far more rigid. This marked a sharp departure from the political strategy of the late Tudor period, where monarchy and Parliament had often worked together, despite underlying tensions. The growing political alienation under James would eventually culminate in the English Civil War, a conflict that was a far cry from the relative stability Elizabeth had managed to maintain. Despite the political challenges, Elizabeth's legacy remained alive in the cultural and national identity of England. Her reign had fostered a golden age in the arts, with the works of Shakespeare, Marlowe and other luminaries forever linked to her court. The cultural flourishing of the Elizabethan era was not only a reflection of her personal patronage of the arts, but also a product of her recognition of their power in shaping national identity. Elizabeth's reign had transformed England from a relatively isolated nation into a major player on the global stage, with exploration and naval power as central components of its rise. However, after her death, the momentum of her cultural achievements seemed to slow under the reign of her successors. James I, though supportive of the arts, did not possess the same level of personal engagement with them as Elizabeth had. The result was a decline in the vibrancy of the artistic scene that had flourished during her reign. Although the works produced during the Elizabethan era would continue to influence English culture for centuries to come. Elizabeth had also been a visionary in her approach to religious unity, which was particularly evident in her deft handling of the Protestant-Catholic divide. Under her leadership, England had firmly embraced Protestantism, but her moderate religious policies had managed to avoid the widespread persecution that plagued much of Europe during the Reformation. Her policies had allowed for a degree of religious tolerance, particularly toward Catholics who remained in England. However, her death created a vacuum in religious leadership, and her successors were not able to maintain the same balance. James I's policies, which leaned toward greater religious tolerance for Catholics, were met with resistance from the Protestant establishment, which had grown stronger during Elizabeth's reign. The religious divisions that had simmered during Elizabeth's time began to resurface, and her successors' inability to replicate her success in this area only intensified the conflicts. While James V struggled to maintain Elizabeth's delicate religious balance, he also faced the challenges of continuing the global ambitions that had been sparked during her reign. Elizabeth had understood that England's future was tied to its naval power and its ability to explore new territories. She had encouraged voyages to the New World and had supported privateers like Sir Francis Drake, whose exploits had extended England's influence abroad. Under her rule, England began to take its first steps toward empire, with colonies in the Americas and a growing presence in global trade routes. After Elizabeth's death, however, the focus shifted away from exploration as the new king, more concerned with domestic stability, was unable to maintain the same level of engagement with colonial expansion. The rising tensions between England and Spain, while not resolved, were also overshadowed by the growing internal conflicts that plagued the Stuart monarchy. Nonetheless, Elizabeth's legacy continued to shape English identity in profound ways. She had created an image of the monarch as both a political leader and a symbol of national unity. Her image as the Virgin Queen Mère had become synonymous with England itself, untouchable, independent and resilient in the face of both internal and external pressures. This image endured long after her death, especially as her successors struggled to live up to the standards she had set. The idea of England as a united, powerful and independent nation, free from the constraints of foreign influence, became a core element of national pride, something that would continue to define the country for centuries. In the centuries following Elizabeth's death, her reign would be romanticised as a time of England's greatest achievements: the flourishing of the arts, the successful defence against Spain, and the cultural vibrancy of her court became emblematic of a time when England had been at the height of its power. Even as the political landscape shifted and the monarchy faced challenges, the idea of the Elizabethan age remained a point of reference, a golden era when England had stood firm in its identity and had been led by one of the most extraordinary monarchs in history. Elizabeth I had not only shaped the course of English politics, but had helped forge a national identity that would endure well into the future. Her death may have marked the end of an era, but the foundations she had built, both politically and culturally, continued to influence the direction of England for generations to come. In many ways, the success and failures of the English monarchy after her death were measured against her remarkable reign, and her influence remained a defining element of the nation's history. The decades following Elizabeth I's death saw her legacy morph into something of a cultural and political ideal, a standard by which monarchs would inevitably be judged. Her reign had been defined by a combination of personal strength, diplomatic finesse, and national pride, qualities that allowed her to guide England through turbulent waters and to leave behind a nation that had emerged as a significant power in Europe. Her successors, though skilled in their own ways, would often struggle to capture the careful balance she had so adeptly maintained. Her death marked the beginning of the Stuart dynasty, but it also highlighted the difficulties of maintaining the political equilibrium she had established. As England moved from one monarch to the next, Elizabeth's reign stood as a reminder of what England had been under her rule, a symbol of unity, independence, and strength. James Vi's ascension to the throne in 1603 marked the beginning of a new era, but it was an era that was weighed down by the memory of Elizabeth's exceptional reign. James, though capable, lacked Elizabeth's finesse in handling the delicate balance of power between the monarchy and Parliament. His belief in the divine right of kings and his attempts to assert more direct control over the government created significant tension with Parliament, which had grown in influence during Elizabeth's rule. While Elizabeth had been able to maintain a cooperative relationship with Parliament, James's authoritarian approach to governance quickly eroded the sense of trust and cooperation that had characterised the latter part of the Tudor period. This tension, compounded by issues of religion and foreign policy, would lead to conflicts that would ultimately shape England's political future for generations. The political shift that began with James I's reign was not just a product of his style, but a response to the legacy of Elizabeth's reign. Her ability to govern with a combination of strength and diplomacy had made her a beloved figure, and her decision to leave the throne without a direct heir had ensured that the monarchy would face a new set of challenges. The lack of a clear successor had placed England in a precarious position, as James's foreign background and his difficulty navigating the complex English political landscape became sources of division. While Elizabeth had kept a delicate balance, James's reign marked a departure from the more pragmatic politics of the late Tudors. On the global stage, Elizabeth's influence continued to shape England's place in the world. During her reign, England had begun to establish its presence in the Americas and the Far East, embarking on the first stages of what would later become the British Empire. Elizabeth's support of explorers and privateers like Sir Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh had set the groundwork for England's imperial ambitions. However, under James I, these ambitions were overshadowed by the political instability within the kingdom. The focus on domestic issues and religious tensions meant that the expansionist policies that had characterised Elizabeth's reign were no longer a priority. The shift in focus, combined with the internal struggles of the Stuart monarchy, slowed England's global growth for a time. Culturally, the end of the Elizabethan age marked a period of transition in England. Elizabeth's reign had seen the emergence of some of the greatest literary and artistic achievements in history, with playwrights like Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Ben Jonson shaping the cultural landscape of their time. Elizabeth had been a staunch patron of the arts, understanding that the flourishing of literature, theatre and music was not only a reflection of national identity, but also a way to cement England's place in the cultural world. Her death, however, marked a shift in both the political and cultural spheres. The vibrancy of the Elizabethan court, which had nurtured some of the greatest minds in history, was gradually replaced by the more restrained atmosphere of the early Stuart period. While James I continued to support the arts, he did so without the same fervour or personal involvement that had marked Elizabeth's reign, and this shift contributed to the gradual decline of the golden age that had defined Elizabethan England. Despite the political and cultural shifts that followed Elizabeth's death, her legacy remained a defining element of English identity. Her reign had solidified England's independence from Catholic Europe and established a Protestant identity that would endure for centuries. The sense of national pride and unity she had cultivated became central to the English character, and her image as a strong, capable monarch continued to inspire those who followed in her footsteps. Even as the political landscape shifted under the Stuarts, Elizabeth remained a figurehead of what England could be, a nation united under a powerful and visionary leader. In the centuries after her death, Elizabeth I continued to serve as a symbol of English greatness. Her reign, often romanticised, became the high watermark of England's power and cultural achievement. Historians and politicians alike would continually look back to her as a benchmark, comparing her to later monarchs and questioning whether any ruler could ever measure up to her unparalleled blend of political skill, cultural awareness, and national unity. Elizabeth had forged a legacy not only as a monarch, but as a symbol of what strong, wise leadership could achieve, and her impact on the history of England would be felt long after the monarchy had changed hands. Tensions that Elizabeth had so carefully managed, the rise of religious dissent and the growing divide between Protestants and Catholics, set the stage for a period of religious conflict that would plague England for years to come. The political and religious unity Elizabeth had forged through her reign, though impressive, was not as easily preserved once she was gone. The challenge of managing England's religious identity would become one of the defining issues of the Stuart period, contributing to the political instability that would eventually lead to the execution of Charles the Fierce and the temporary abolition of the monarchy. At the same time, Elizabeth's legacy in terms of military and naval power continued to shape England's global ambitions. Under her rule, England had emerged as a formidable naval power, with victories over Spain, most famously the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, cementing England's status as a dominant maritime force. Elizabeth had understood the importance of naval power in securing England's place in the world, and her support for exploration had helped lay the foundations for England's future empire. However, after her death, the monarchy found itself at a crossroads. The political struggles of James I and his successors limited their ability to focus on military expansion. While the colonies Elizabeth had supported in the Americas continued to grow, the political and financial challenges faced by the Stuart monarchy prevented the same level of commitment to overseas expansion that had characterised the Elizabethan age. The empire building that Elizabeth had set in motion would continue, but it would take time for the English monarchy to reclaim its position as a global power. Culturally, the Elizabethan age remained a high point in English history, even as the political landscape shifted dramatically under the Stuarts. The golden age of English drama, led by Shakespeare and his contemporaries, had flourished under Elizabeth's reign, and her support for the arts had given birth to a new era in English literature. After her death, the theatre continued to thrive, but the energy and innovation that had characterised the Elizabethan court began to wane. James I did continue to support the arts, but his reign lacked the same personal investment in cultural patronage that had made Elizabeth's court a beacon of intellectual and artistic achievement. The decline in royal engagement with the arts, combined with the political turmoil of the Stuart period, meant that the creative vibrancy of the Elizabethan era was never fully replicated. While Elizabeth's reign had seen a flourishing of literature and drama that would become the foundation of English literary tradition, the early 17th century saw a retreat from the heights of artistic expression that had marked her time on the throne. Elizabeth's death also marked the end of an era of relative political stability. Her reign had been one of extraordinary control and strategic diplomacy, during which England had flourished both politically and culturally. Under her leadership, the nation had been united, its economy had expanded, and its military power had been strengthened. Her death, however, created a shift in the monarchy's relationship with its subjects. James I and his successors would face growing pressures from an increasingly powerful parliament, and the monarchy would no longer be able to wield the same level of authority it had enjoyed under Elizabeth. The changing political landscape of the Stuart period highlighted the fragility of the balance that Elizabeth had so carefully maintained, and the rise of parliamentary power would soon lead to a new era in England's history, a period that would redefine the relationship between the monarchy and the people. In the end, Elizabeth I's reign remains one of the most important chapters in English history. Her ability to navigate the complex political, cultural and religious currents of her time left a lasting impact on the country. Despite the challenges her successors faced, Elizabeth's legacy continued to shape the monarchy, English society and national identity. Her reign had set a standard for what effective and visionary leadership could achieve, and it would be remembered for centuries as a time when England was at the height of its power, both at home and abroad. Elizabeth's extraordinary rise to power, her remarkable governance, and her ability to leave an indelible mark on history ensured that her legacy would never be forgotten. Elizabeth IV's reign, though ending in 1603, continued to define the path of English history for many generations. Her legacy, shaped by the trials and triumphs of her rule, became a cornerstone of English identity. In the centuries following her death, the memory of her reign persisted in the cultural, political, and even religious fabric of the nation. While her successors grappled with the challenges of uniting a kingdom fractured by internal divisions and foreign pressures, Elizabeth's influence remained a constant reminder of what a monarch could achieve. As the Stuarts took the throne, they found themselves not only facing the complexities of governance, but also living under the shadow of the greatest ruler in English history, a queen whose reign had defined an entire age. James I's reign, while marked by some successes, proved difficult as it contrasted sharply with the stability of Elizabeth's period. His assertion of divine right and his attempts to centralise power within the monarchy sparked conflict with Parliament. Unlike Elizabeth, who had been able to balance royal authority with Parliament's growing power, James I was less adept at managing this crucial relationship. His reliance on royal prerogative and his efforts to assert his authority over the growing parliamentary influence resulted in a rift that would only widen during the reign of his son Charles I. The political framework that Elizabeth had so carefully cultivated, one that allowed for cooperation between the monarchy and Parliament, slowly eroded under the Stuarts, culminating in the English Civil War. Elizabeth's careful diplomacy had kept England relatively unified, but her successors were less skilled at navigating the complex dynamics between monarchy and government. In the realm of religion, the legacy of Elizabeth's reign was equally significant. Elizabeth's religious settlement had established Protestantism as the dominant faith in England, but it had also allowed space for some degree of Catholic and Catholic sympathising tolerance. This fragile religious peace held for much of her reign, but would prove difficult to maintain after her death. While Elizabeth had played a masterful hand in managing religious factions, her successors were less able to find the same balance. James I's policy of religious tolerance toward Catholics, which was in stark contrast to Elizabeth's more restrictive stance toward Catholicism, caused discontent among Protestant factions who had grown accustomed to the stability that Elizabeth had enforced. The tensions between Catholic and Protestant interests remained one of the primary challenges of the Stuart period, contributing to political instability and fueling discontent with the monarchy. While Elizabeth's successors may have struggled to manage the same religious and political conflicts, her reign left an indelible cultural legacy. Her patronage of the arts, her support for explorers, and her emphasis on national pride during her reign helped lay the foundations for a cultural renaissance that would continue to shape England's global influence. The works of Shakespeare and his contemporaries, produced in the theatres that flourished under Elizabeth's patronage, became the foundation of English literature and drama for centuries. Her reign had ushered in a golden age of exploration, during which England began its slow and steady rise as an imperial power. Figures like Sir Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh, emboldened by Elizabeth's support, would lay the groundwork for what would later become the British Empire. Elizabeth had seen the importance of establishing England's presence on the world stage, and her efforts to sponsor exploration and naval power set the tone for England's imperial ambitions in the centuries that followed. Yet even as her influence remained present, the decline of Elizabeth's court atmosphere under the Stuart kings became apparent. James III and Charles I, though not without their own support of the arts, did not share the same deep engagement with the creative community that Elizabeth had. The culture of intellectual and artistic freedom that had flourished at the Elizabethan court began to fade. Elizabeth's court had been a place where ideas could be exchanged freely, and the arts could thrive without heavy censorship. Under the early Stuarts, however, the influence of the monarchy over the arts became more restrictive, particularly as religious and political tensions rose. The Elizabethan age had seen the blossoming of English theatre, literature and music, but under James and Charles, the vibrancy of English cultural life began to dissipate. Moreover, Elizabeth's strategic use of marriage diplomacy, particularly her handling of numerous European suitors, had allowed her to maintain both political autonomy and influence. Her choice to remain unmarried and her ability to use the prospect of marriage as a diplomatic tool had been key in preserving England's independence, while maintaining a strong image as a leader in control of her destiny. The later Stuarts, however, struggled with similar issues. James I's marriage to Anne of Denmark, while personally successful, did little to secure political alliances that were as beneficial to England as Elizabeth's carefully considered suitors had been. Charles I's own marital choices, notably his marriage to the Catholic Henrietta Maria of France, further alienated the Protestant majority in England, deepening the political and religious divisions that Elizabeth had worked so hard to mitigate. Elizabeth's influence on England's identity also persisted beyond the political and cultural spheres. Her reign had shaped the national narrative, creating an image of England as a proud, independent nation. She had, through her actions and decisions, fostered a sense of national pride that endured long after her death. Even as her successors faced difficulties, Elizabeth's image remained a cornerstone of the national psyche. The Virgin Queen persona, representing purity and independence, remained central to how the English people viewed their past and their future. Elizabeth had not only defined the role of the monarch, but had also defined what it meant to be English. Her reign had solidified the idea of England as a powerful, unified force on the world stage, and that idea would continue to shape England's national identity for generations. As England moved into the 17th century, it was clear that Elizabeth I had set a high bar for her successors. Her reign had represented a time when England had stood at the peak of its power, both politically and culturally. Even as the political landscape changed under the Stuarts, and as England faced the pressures of internal strife and religious conflict, Elizabeth's reign remained a touchstone for what England had been and what it could become. Her reign had demonstrated the power of a visionary leadership, the strength of a unified nation, and the cultural potential of a kingdom that had embraced the arts and exploration. In the centuries to follow, Elizabeth I would continue to be remembered as one of the greatest monarchs in history, a queen who had transformed England and whose legacy would endure in the nation she had forged. As England moved further into the 17th century, the weight of Elizabeth's reign became increasingly apparent in both the political and cultural landscape of the country. Her death had marked the end of an era, and her legacy would influence the monarchy, national identity, and political future for generations to come. While her successors, particularly James I and Charles III, struggled with the challenges of governing in the wake of such a towering figure, Elizabeth's ability to maintain a delicate balance between monarchy and parliament, and her mastery of international diplomacy, became the standard by which future rulers would be measured. The Stuart monarchs, inheriting a united England with Elizabeth's achievements, now faced a more complex world that her policies had helped shape. One of the greatest lessons that James I and his successors learned, albeit the hard way, was the political significance of the relationship between monarchy and parliament. Elizabeth had set a precedent for coexisting with parliament, making it clear that, while the monarch held supreme authority, there needed to be cooperation with the governing body to ensure stability. Her reign had skillfully navigated political tensions, providing space for Parliament's growing influence without undermining the monarchy. But James I, unlike Elizabeth, did not understand the necessity of compromise. His insistence on divine right and royal prerogative alienated Parliament, setting the stage for conflicts that would deepen under his son Charles I. This failure to maintain the delicate political balance Elizabeth had mastered would ultimately contribute to the breakdown of the monarchy in the 17th century. James I's conflicts with Parliament were not merely the result of his autocratic tendencies, but also a reflection of the changes that had taken place in English politics during Elizabeth's reign. Elizabeth had been a shrewd manager of the court, carefully balancing the demands of her nobles and the rising middle class, understanding that the stability of the monarchy depended on the cooperation of her subjects. James, on the other hand, saw his power as divinely ordained, and sought to centralise authority, disregarding the growing influence of Parliament. His struggles to assert royal prerogative, particularly when it came to issues of taxation and foreign policy, would create an atmosphere of distrust that would only grow under Charles I, leading to civil war. The shift in the political climate after Elizabeth's death highlighted the fragility of the political structures she had so carefully put in place. While Elizabeth had cultivated a sense of unity among her people, and had navigated the challenges of foreign diplomacy and internal dissent, her successors found themselves unable to manage the growing divisions within England. Religious conflicts, political intrigues, and economic instability combined to create a turbulent environment, one that Elizabeth's pragmatic leadership had kept at bay. In the wake of her reign, England's national identity began to shift, and the monarchy's grip on power weakened as the social and political fabric of the nation became increasingly complex. Despite these struggles, Elizabeth's reign remained a high point in England's history, one that was celebrated and revered in the generations that followed. Her reign had been defined by her ability to adapt to the shifting currents of European politics and domestic governance, ensuring England's survival through a period of religious upheaval, foreign invasion, and internal strife. The military victories she achieved, especially the defeat of the Spanish Armada, were not just military triumphs, they were symbols of English resilience and independence. The image of Elizabeth as the steadfast Virgin Queen became an enduring symbol of national pride, an emblem of what England could achieve under strong and visionary leadership. Culturally, Elizabeth's influence continued to resonate for generations. Her court had been a centre of artistic and intellectual exchange, and her support for the arts had produced some of the most remarkable works in English literature. The works of Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Spenser, all of whom were active during her reign, became the foundation of English literature, influencing generations of writers and poets. Elizabeth had understood that the arts were not merely entertainment, but a powerful tool for shaping public opinion and national identity. Under her patronage, English theatre and literature had flourished, and these achievements became intrinsic to the nation's cultural legacy. Even though her successors, particularly James I, were less personally engaged with the arts, Elizabeth's vision of an England enriched by intellectual and artistic pursuit lived on. Her influence was also evident in England's growing presence on the world stage. Elizabeth's reign had seen the beginning of English exploration and imperial expansion, setting the stage for the British Empire. She had been a champion of exploration, backing voyages by figures like Sir Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh, whose expeditions laid the groundwork for the global influence England would eventually wield. Elizabeth had understood the importance of maritime power in securing England's place in the world, and her reign had marked the beginning of England's rise as a naval superpower. After her death, the expansion of English influence continued, though the political and financial challenges faced by her successors slowed the momentum that Elizabeth had set in motion. Still, her vision of an England with a vast and influential global presence remained a driving force in English imperialism. In the years following her death, Elizabeth's legacy continued to be honoured and idealised. Her reign had set a standard for what a monarch could accomplish. A nation unified under strong leadership, a powerful military capable of defending its sovereignty, a thriving cultural landscape, and a respected place in the international community. Even though her successors faced political instability and religious conflict, Elizabeth's reign remained a touchstone for those who sought to return to the model of strong independent leadership she had established. The ideal of the Elizabethan age, with its cultural vibrancy and national unity, continued to serve as a symbol of England's greatness, both in the past and for the future. The story of Elizabeth I was one of transformation and triumph, from the uncertain beginnings of a neglected child to the reign of one of the most iconic monarchs in history. Her reign had not been without its struggles, but it was defined by her ability to navigate the complex political landscape of her time, securing England's position as a powerful, cool, independent nation. The legacy of her reign, in both the political and cultural spheres, would live on, providing inspiration for rulers, artists and intellectuals alike. Elizabeth I had left an indelible mark on history, and her influence would continue to be felt long after her death, shaping not only the future of England but also the world.